Hey guys, tonight we begin with something far from polished palaces or golden thrones. This is the slow, sand-chafed reality of life as a Persian immortal on campaign. These elite soldiers were the pride of the Achaemenid Empire, dressed in fine fabrics and armored precision. But beneath the glamour, it was less honor, more exhaustion. Picture weeks on the road through blistering heat and rocky terrain, your feet wrapped in worn sandals, your gear sticking to your skin in the midday sun. Food was dry. Water was warmer than you wanted it to be. And the constant routine, march, train, polish, repeat, turned every day into a quiet, aching endurance test. Immortal? Not exactly. Just 10,000 men expected to look perfect, feel nothing, and keep moving no matter what rubbed raw underneath the linen. Before we get into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending your nights drifting through overlooked corners of history. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always a pleasure seeing who's joining from dusk to dawn. Now dim the lights, let the fan hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey, beginning in the warm boots of a Persian immortal, one slow march at a time. Imagine yourself waking before the sun, the sky still cool and purple. You sleep on a woven mat, tucked beside thousands of others in a makeshift camp that smells faintly of sweat, leather, and old ash. Your bones ache not because of battle, but because the last night's rest was cut short by the horn of an officer who values order over comfort. The call to rise is never loud, never rushed, just a hollow signal that echoes across the camp. Time to move again. The Persian Immortals were the elite core of the Achaemenid military, 10,000 strong. But don't let the title mislead you. They weren't supernatural, and they certainly weren't immune to fatigue, sunburn, or bad food. The name Immortal referred to their perpetual number. When one man died, another was immediately promoted. The illusion of permanence. But beneath the shine of bronze and iron was the very human burden of keeping up appearances. They wore layered garments under armor, wool and linen that clung to the skin when soaked with sweat. The empire stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, and campaigns meant weeks, often months, of travel on foot through lands that were hostile, not just in politics, but in climate. Rocky hills, dry riverbeds, sandstorms that left a film on your teeth. Horses were reserved for officers or the cavalry. Most walked. They carried their own kits, often including a bow, a spear, a short sword, and a small wicker shield. It wasn't just heavy, it was awkward. And if you dropped something, well, you just keep moving. The weight of that equipment told its own story. A Persian spear could stretch 9 feet in length, crafted from ash wood and tipped with iron that had been hammered flat and sharp by smiths who knew their work would taste blood before the season ended. The bow was composite, layers of horn and sinew and wood bound with animal glue, requiring strength to draw that left shoulder's aching after a day of practice. Arrows nested in quivers of leather, each one fletched with eagle feathers that caught the wind with a particular whistle. The short sword and akinates hung from a belt that also held a water skin, a pouch for dried meat, and whatever personal items a man could justify carrying. Some tucked away small bronze mirrors. Others kept carved ivory dice. A few carried letters from wives or children, folded and refolded until the words began to fade. The wicker shield, painted with the winged sun of Ahura Mazda, was deceptively light but awkward to maneuver in formation. It caught on neighboring shields, snagged on low branches, and offered little protection against a determined enemy with a long spear. But it was part of the uniform, part of the image, and image mattered more than practicality when you served the King of Kings. Food on campaign wasn't what you'd think for an elite course. Salted fish, cracked wheat, dried fruits, if lucky. They'd carry pressed cakes of barley or dates in waxed skins, often sharing among comrades to stretch the rations. Water was the real struggle. In desserts, you drank from goatskin bags that gave every sip a faint taste of leather and salt. In mountains, from freezing springs that numbed your teeth and made your stomach cramp. Sometimes it was clear, sometimes cloudy. But thirst doesn't wait for clarity. Dysentery was a quiet enemy, ignored until it became unignorable. The reality of campaign rations painted a grimmer picture than the golden halls of Persepolis might suggest. Breakfast, if it came at all, was a handful of barley meal mixed with water into a paste that had all the flavor of wet clay. Sometimes there were onions, pungent and sharp, that at least made the mouth water. Dried fish came in strips that had been salted until they turned leather hard, requiring slow chewing and patience. Fresh meat was a rarity reserved for officers or special occasions when the column encountered friendly settlements willing to trade. Water discipline was absolute. Each man received his ration at dawn and sunset, measured carefully by quartermasters who had learned to ignore pleading eyes and cracked lips. The goatskin bags sweated in the heat, and the water inside grew warm and stale, sometimes developing a green film that had to be skimmed away before drinking. In the worst stretches, through the salt deserts east of Mesopotamia, men learned to hold water in their mouths for long minutes before swallowing, savoring every drop. When supply lines stretched thin or broke entirely, the immortals foraged like common soldiers. They learned which roots were safe to dig, which berries wouldn't twist your gut into knots, how to catch small lizards and roast them over fires built from dried grass. Pride meant little when your stomach clenched with hunger, and even the elite of the empire found themselves scraping bark from trees or boiling leather into something resembling broth. Training never stopped, even during campaign. Formations had to be perfect, lines sharp, weapons polished. The image of the immortals mattered. When the king's eye or his spies were near, you stood straighter. Your chin lifted, no matter how blistered your feet or sunburned your neck. Replacements were always ready. Discipline was not just expected. It was enforced with the weight of reputation and the fear of demotion. Fall behind, and you might not be missed until it was too late. The training regime was merciless in its attention to detail. Each morning, before the column began its march, the immortals practiced their formations. The Hazarabam, their commander of 1,000, would bark orders in Old Persian, while subordinate officers translated into Median, Elamite, or whatever tongue the men best understood. The empire was a patchwork of peoples, and even its elite guard spoke in many voices. They drilled the advance in echelon, where each rank stepped forward in sequence, creating a rippling effect that could overwhelm enemy formations through sheer coordination. They practiced the defensive square, shields locked together, spear points bristling outward, like the quills of some enormous porcupine. They rehearsed the fighting withdrawal, perhaps the most difficult maneuver of all, where discipline mattered more than courage, because turning your back to an enemy required absolute trust in the men beside you. Archery practice continued even on the march. Men would loose arrows at targets hastily constructed from bundles of grass or cloth, competing to see who could hit marks while walking, while kneeling, while standing in formation. The composite bows required constant maintenance, their bindings checked for fraying, their strings waxed against moisture. A broken bowstring in battle meant death, so each man carried spares wrapped in oiled cloth. Weapons had to gleam. Rust was an offense that could earn a man lashes or extra duties. Each evening, after the camp was set, the immortals sat in circles sharpening their spear points on whetstones carried for that purpose, oiling their sword blades with fat saved from the last decent meal, polishing their armor with sand and leather until it caught the firelight. The work was meditative, almost ritualistic, hands moving in patterns learned through years of repetition, while minds wandered to homes and families left behind. And then there was the ceremony. The Persian Empire prized pageantry. Banners fluttered in the wind, their silk and gold thread catching sunlight like captured fire. Trumpets sounded when commanders passed, brass instruments that had been carried from the workshops of Babylon and Susa. Marshes were more than practical, they were performances. Cloaks had to sit just right, their purple and crimson dyes marking rank and status. Beards had to be trimmed according to regulation, oiled and combed until they lay flat against bronze-scarred chests. Spears upright, their points catching the light in synchronized flashes. Shields angled for uniformity, each one painted with the same symbols, the same colors, the same fierce pride. Even exhaustion had to look dignified. Some men found pride in it. Others found only silence, each day blurring into the next. The pageantry extended beyond simple marching order. When the column entered cities or passed through provinces loyal to the empire, the immortals became actors in a grand theatrical display. Their armor was polished to mirror brightness, their weapons adorned with ribbons and small bells that chimed with each step. They wore their finest cloaks, the ones reserved for court ceremonies, heavy with embroidered lions and griffins that caught the eye from great distances. Local governors would emerge from their palaces with retinues of scribes and servants, offering tribute and protestations of loyalty, while their eyes counted the spear points in the passing ranks. Children lined the roads, wide-eyed at the spectacle, while merchants calculated the cost of feeding and equipping such a force. Every gesture was choreographed, every movement designed to communicate the power and reach of the Achaemenid throne. But the ceremony could be exhausting in its own way. Maintaining perfect posture for hours under a blazing sun while wearing full armor and ceremonial dress was its own form of torture. Men fainted in the ranks, falling silently forward while trying not to disrupt the formation. Others developed splitting headaches from the weight of bronze helmets that hadn't been designed for extended wear. The lucky ones wore padded caps underneath, but many made do with strips of cloth that grew soggy with sweat and provided little cushioning against the metal that seemed to concentrate the sun's heat into a focused burning point on their skulls. Beneath the sandaled feet, the terrain was unforgiving. Stones bit through soles that had been hardened by years of marching, but never quite hardened enough. Sand slipped into boots and never truly came out, grinding against skin with every step, working its way between toes until walking became a constant irritation. At night, you'd shake out your clothes and gear and still find the grit nestled in seams, collar folds, the spaces between armor plates. Skin rubbed raw where leather straps crossed shoulders, or where bronze edges pressed against unprotected flesh. Some developed sores that made each step wince-worthy, angry red welts that oozed and attracted flies. But there were no sick days. No shade except for command tents that were reserved for officers and visiting dignitaries. No relief except for the knowledge that eventually, perhaps, the column would halt. The geography of empire was written in the aches and pains of soldiers' bodies. Through the limestone hills of Syria, where every step sent shockwaves up leg bones and the chalky dust-coated throats until speaking became difficult. Across the shifting sands of the great desert, where the ground gave way with each footfall and walking became like climbing an endless, invisible mountain. Through the marshlands of lower Mesopotamia, where the humid air felt thick enough to swim through and mosquitoes swarmed in clouds that turned the sky gray, leaving every exposed inch of skin dotted with angry red bites. Mountain passes were perhaps the worst, where the air grew thin and cold, where breath came in short gasps that burned the lungs, where ice formed on weapons overnight and had to be chipped away each morning. The trails were narrow, forcing the column to stretch for miles, making communication between front and rear nearly impossible. Men stumbled on loose scree that shifted underfoot like ball bearings, sending unfortunate soldiers tumbling down slopes littered with sharp stones and thorny scrub. But even the flat plains had their own miseries. The endless grasslands of the east, where the horizon stretched unbroken in all directions, and the wind never stopped blowing, carrying with it the scent of distant fires and the constant whisper of moving air through dry vegetation. The sun reflected off the grass in ways that strained the eyes, and men learned to squint constantly, developing deep lines that aged them beyond their years. Sometimes they marched toward conflict, sometimes toward an outpost. Sometimes it wasn't clear. Orders were given in clipped tones. You followed, you obeyed. And when the battle did come, it came like a wall of noise and dust. But more often than not, it didn't. Instead, it was just more walking, more waiting, more appearances. The uncertainty was perhaps the most wearing aspect of campaign life. Rumors spread through the ranks like wildfire, each one more fantastic than the last. They were marching to put down a rebellion in Bactria. No, they were heading to the Indus to establish new provinces. Actually, they were returning to Persepolis for the New Year festival. The truth, when it came at all, usually arrived in fragments passed down through the chain of command, filtered through multiple languages and interpretation, until the original message bore little resemblance to what reached the common soldiers. Orders came at odd hours, shouted by officers who seemed as confused as anyone. Pack up, we march at dawn. No, wait, we stay another day. Form ranks for inspection. Stand down, inspection postponed. The constant state of readiness without purpose wore on men's nerves, creating a tension that expressed itself in short tempers and sudden arguments over trivial matters. When battles did come, they often ended before most of the immortals could engage. The sight of 10,000 elite troops in perfect formation was usually enough to convince local chieftains or rebel governors that negotiation might be preferable to warfare. The immortals would spend days preparing for assault, sharpening weapons and reviewing tactics, only to watch from a distance as diplomats worked out surrender terms in the shade of silk pavilions. Even when combat was unavoidable, it rarely matched the heroic narratives that circulated around palace courtyards. Most fighting consisted of brief, brutal encounters, where superior numbers and equipment overwhelmed enemies who were poorly organized and worse equipped. The immortals would advance in formation, a wall of bronze and iron and painted shields, and enemy forces would break before contact, streaming away across fields or into forests where pursuit became impossible. The real battles, the ones remembered in songs and stone carvings, were rare enough that veterans who had participated in them became celebrities of a sort within the ranks. They would tell their stories around evening campfires, describing the clash of bronze on bronze, the weight of a sword arm after hours of fighting, the particular sound that arrows made when they found their mark. Younger soldiers listened with the intensity of scholars studying sacred texts, trying to extract practical wisdom that might keep them alive when their turn came. Pay was steady but uninspiring. Silver coins came at intervals, but they were often eaten up by supply costs, replacing worn gear, buying small comforts, bribing quartermasters for better rations. And while common soldiers looted, immortals were expected to maintain order. Their reward wasn't wealth, it was status. But status doesn't warm you on a cold night. It doesn't soothe a pulled muscle or ease the hunger in your belly. The economics of military service painted their own picture of empire. A Persian immortal's pay, while regular, barely covered the cost of maintaining the appearance expected of elite troops. Armor required constant repair. Leather needed replacement. Weapons had to be kept sharp and bright. The bronze scales on their armor were sewn to leather backing that rotted in humid climates and cracked in dry ones. Replacing a full set could cost months of wages. Small comforts came at premium prices from the merchants who followed the army like vultures trailing a wounded animal. A cup of wine might cost what a civilian paid for a week's worth of bread. A piece of fresh fruit could consume a day's wages. Clean clothes, a decent meal, a night's shelter in something more substantial than a tent. All of these required negotiations with camp followers who understood the desperation of men far from home and priced their goods accordingly. The prohibition against looting created additional financial strain. while common soldiers could supplement their income by pillaging conquered territories. The Immortals were expected to maintain discipline and order. They watched as auxiliary troops loaded themselves down with captured gold and silver while they stood guard duty, protecting supply trains and maintaining perimeters. Their reward for this restraint was supposed to be honor and status, but honor couldn't be traded for food or used to repair broken equipment. Some men found ways around the restrictions. They would trade their rations to auxiliaries in exchange for small valuable items found during the cleanup after battles. Others sold their services as guards to wealthy merchants in the camp's marketplace, earning a few extra coins by protecting goods from the very soldiers they served alongside. A few became unofficial bankers, lending money to their comrades at rates that would have made Persian merchants proud. The hierarchy within the Immortals created its own economic pressures. Lower-ranking soldiers were expected to maintain their equipment and appearance to the same standard as officers, but without the additional allowances that came with command positions. They watched their superiors dine on fine foods served on silver plates, while they gnawed on leather-hard fish and moldy bread. The resentment this created was carefully managed through a combination of tradition, discipline, and the occasional sharing of officers' privileges during religious festivals or after particularly difficult marches. And yet, many stayed, some out of loyalty, some for family pride, others because there was nowhere else to go. In a kingdom this vast, with languages shifting every few miles, the army was a strange constant. Familiar rituals, familiar chants, familiar suffering, and the Immortals were its anchor. The bonds that held the Immortals together went deeper than mere military discipline. These men had shared experiences that created relationships stronger than blood. They had seen each other at their worst, covered in filth and exhausted beyond endurance, and at their best, standing firm in battle when lesser troops fled. They had shared water in the desert, given up their own rations to feed a sick comrade, carried wounded friends on their backs through mountain passes where every step was agony. The diversity of the empire was reflected in the ranks of the Immortals themselves. Persians served alongside Medes, Bactrians fought beside Sogdians, men from the shores of the Black Sea marched with those from the deserts of Gedrosia. They brought with them different gods, different customs, different ways of understanding the world, but the shared experience of service gradually forged them into something approaching a unified force. Religious observances became communal affairs that transcended ethnic boundaries. Persian fire altars burned beside Syrian shrines, while Babylonian priests offered sacrifices according to rituals that predated the empire by centuries. The Immortals learned fragments of each other's prayers, picked up words in foreign tongues, developed a hybrid culture that belonged fully to no single people, but somehow encompassed them all. For many, the army had become their true home. Veterans who had served for decades had spent more time with their fellow soldiers than with their birth families. They knew the sound of each other's breathing, could recognize footsteps in the dark, understood without words when a comrade was struggling with homesickness or battle fatigue. These relationships provided an emotional anchor in a world where everything else seemed to shift like desert sand. The pride of belonging to the Immortals was real, despite all the hardships. When they entered cities and crowds gathered to watch them pass, when children pointed at their gleaming armor and whispered in awe, when enemy commanders studied their formations with obvious respect, the soldiers felt the weight of their reputation. They were part of something larger than themselves, representatives of an empire that stretched from sunrise to sunset, guardians of a peace that allowed trade to flourish and peoples to prosper. At night, the camp settled into uneasy silence. Fires crackled with the particular sound of dry wood burning, sending sparks up into darkness that seemed to press close around the small circles of light. Quiet voices murmured in Old Persian or Elamite or Aramaic, discussing the day's march, speculating about tomorrow's destination, sharing news from letters that had somehow found their way from distant provinces. Someone plucked at a stringed instrument, slow and hollow, playing melodies that carried hints of homeland and loss. Some men polished their weapons by moonlight, the rhythmic scraping of whetstones against bronze, creating a percussion that matched the beating of their hearts. Others stared at the stars and wondered what they looked like from home, trying to match the constellations they saw to the ones they remembered from childhood nights when the world seemed smaller and safer. Most simply slept, curled beside their packs, one hand always resting near their sword. The night sounds of an army camp created their own strange symphony. The snoring of exhausted men mixed with the shifting of guards, the stamp of horses, the distant howl of wolves or jackals drawn by the scent of food scraps. Sentries called to each other in low voices, passwords and responses that confirmed all was well, though well was always relative when you slept on the ground with one eye open. Dreams, when they came, often carried men home. They would find themselves walking through familiar streets, sitting at tables laden with foods they hadn't tasted in years, holding children who had grown beyond recognition in their absence. Some woke from these dreams with tears on their cheeks, others with smiles that faded quickly as reality reasserted itself. A few learned not to dream at all, training themselves to sleep lightly, never quite surrendering consciousness to the mercy of memory. The most vivid dreams were often the cruelest. A soldier might dream of his wife's cooking, the exact taste of her bread still warm from the oven, the particular way she seasoned lamb with herbs from her garden. He would wake with the phantom taste still on his tongue, only to face another breakfast of barley paste and stale water. Others dreamed of their children's laughter, of small hands tugging at their beards, of stories told by firelight in rooms that smelled of home instead of leather and sweat and the metallic tang of weapons. Some men wrote letters they would never send, scratching words onto broken pottery or smooth stones with charcoal from the fires. They would describe the landscapes they had seen, the strange customs of foreign peoples, the weight of homesickness that pressed against their chests like a physical burden. These letters would be hidden in packs or buried beside campsites, small monuments to feelings that could not be spoken aloud without breaking the careful facade of military discipline. The Immortals developed their own rituals for dealing with the isolation and uncertainty of campaign life. They would share stories of home, each man contributing details about his village or city until a collective mythology emerged, a patchwork homeland that belonged to all of them. They learned each other's songs, mixing Persian melodies with Median rhythms, Bactrian harmonies with Sogdian lyrics, creating music that had never existed before but somehow felt ancient and familiar. Food became another form of connection. Men would trade rations, not because they were dissatisfied with their own, but because eating something that reminded another soldier of home created a bond that transcended mere military duty. A Bactrian might trade his dried grapes for a Persian salted fish, not because he preferred the taste, but because he had seen tears in his comrade's eyes when the man spoke of the rivers of his homeland. The pre-dawn hours were the worst, when the last watch counted down the moments until reveille, when the sky began to lighten, but the sun remained hidden, when the day's heat was still hours away, but the night's chill had settled into bones and joints. Men would lie still, listening to the sounds of the camp waking around them, dreading the horn that would signal another day of marching, another day of dust and heat and endless horizon. In these quiet moments, the true cost of empire became visible. Bodies worn down by years of service, faces marked by exposure to sun and wind and the constant tension of readiness. Eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything. The Immortals paid for their status with their youth, their health, their connections to the world beyond military service. They became professional strangers, equally foreign in every land they visited, belonging fully to none. But they would rise when the call came, because that was what Immortals did. They would shake the sleep from their eyes, roll their sleeping mats, check their equipment, and take their places in formation. Because despite everything, Despite the hardships and the homesickness and the constant ache of tired muscles, they were still soldiers of the greatest empire the world had ever known. The morning routine was itself a ritual of transformation. Men who had spent the night curled on hard ground like beggars would rise and become immortals again. They would splash their faces with precious water, comb their beards with carved bone combs, oil their hair until it lay flat and gleaming. The armor went on piece by piece, each bronze scale checked for damage, each leather strap tested for wear. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, they had reconstructed themselves into the image that the Empire demanded. The march formation was a work of art that took years to perfect. Each man knew his exact position, could find his place in the column, even in darkness or confusion. The spacing between ranks was measured to the inch, allowing for optimal movement while maintaining the visual impact of massed troops. From a distance, the Immortals moved like a single organism, their individual suffering invisible beneath the coordinated display of power. Weather became another enemy to be endured rather than conquered. In the heat of summer, men learned to march with their mouths closed to conserve moisture, to walk in the shadows of the soldiers ahead when possible. At a time, their water breaks to the moment when thirst became unbearable, but before it became incapacitating. The bronze armor absorbed heat like an oven, and touching it with bare skin after hours in the sun could leave burns that took weeks to heal. Winter campaigns brought different miseries. The same armor that roasted soldiers in summer became a source of bitter cold when temperatures dropped. Metal drew heat from flesh, leaving men shivering even as they maintained perfect formation. Weapons became painful to hold, fingers grew numb and clumsy, and the simple act of drawing a bow could become impossible when the composite materials contracted and stiffened in freezing air. Rain transformed everything. The careful spacing of the formation became treacherous as men slipped on muddy ground. Equipment that had been polished to mirror brightness became streaked with dirt and rust. Leather softened and stretched, causing armor to fit poorly and weapons to shift in their sheaths. The wool cloaks that provided warmth in dry weather became heavy, sodden burdens that smelled like wet animals and never quite dried. But perhaps the greatest challenge was the psychological weight of representing something larger than themselves. Every action was scrutinized, every appearance judged against the reputation of the Immortals. A single soldier who broke formation, who showed weakness, who failed to maintain the standard, could diminish the entire unit in the eyes of allies and enemies alike. This pressure created a particular kind of exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue, a constant vigilance that never allowed for true rest. The Empire's administrative machinery ground on around them, indifferent to their individual struggles. Dispatches arrived with new orders, new destinations, new requirements that had been decided in distant palaces by men who had never felt sand between their teeth or counted the remaining water by the mouthful. The Immortals were pieces on a game board so vast that they could not see its boundaries. Moved by hands they would never shake according to strategies they were not permitted to understand. Yet within this system, small acts of humanity persisted. Veterans would quietly share the tricks they had learned for surviving long campaigns. How to pad armor to prevent chafing, which plants could be eaten safely, how to sleep soundly despite discomfort and danger. Officers, despite their elevated status, sometimes shared their better rations with men who were struggling, though such generosity had to be subtle to avoid undermining discipline. The medical care available to the Immortals was better than what common soldiers received, but still primitive by any standard. Battle wounds were cleaned and stitched by men who had learned their skills through necessity rather than training. Broken bones were set with whatever materials were available, often resulting in limbs that healed crooked and painful. Disease was treated with herbs and prayers, sometimes successfully, more often not. Those who could no longer serve were discharged with small pensions that barely covered the cost of returning home. Many never made the journey, settling instead in garrison towns or trading posts, living on the margins of the empire they had served. They would gather in taverns and tell stories of their service, their tales growing more heroic with each telling, their scars becoming badges of honor rather than reminders of suffering. And come morning, it began again. The column stretched, long and straight, a river of bronze and iron flowing across landscapes that had never seen such organized might. Sand shifted beneath tired feet, each step carrying the weight of empire, each mile measured in the collective will of 10,000 men who had chosen duty over comfort, service over safety. The rhythm of the march became hypnotic after hours on the road. Left foot, right foot, the creak of leather, the whisper of fabric against bronze, the subtle music of thousands of men moving in unison. Some found meditation in this rhythm, letting their minds drift while their bodies continued the automatic process of walking. Others used the time to compose letters they would never send, to plan futures they might never see, to remember faces that grew dimmer with each passing season. The landscape changed around them like scenes from a dream. Rocky hills gave way to fertile valleys. Deserts yielded to grasslands. Rivers were forded and mountains crossed, but the march continued. They were writing the story of the empire with their footsteps, each mile claimed not through conquest, but through the simple act of passing through it under arms, leaving behind the implicit promise that they could return if necessary. Supply trains followed like the tail of a comet, laden with everything needed to maintain the fiction of immortal invincibility. Spare weapons, replacement armor, medical supplies, ceremonial regalia for formal occasions, gifts for local dignitaries, tribute from subject peoples, the accumulated wealth of a dozen provinces moving slowly across the ancient world. The soldiers who guarded these trains knew that they were protecting more than mere supplies. They were safeguarding the material foundation of imperial power. Communication with the outside world became increasingly sporadic as campaigns stretched on. Letters from home, when they arrived at all, brought news that was months old, descriptions of events that felt like they had happened to other people in other lives. Wives had given birth, children had learned to walk, parents had died, harvests had succeeded or failed, all while the immortals marched through landscapes that would never see any of these familiar milestones. And the immortals, as always, marched on. Their footsteps faded into the dust, into silence, into memory. But their passage left marks that would endure long after the last veteran had returned to dust. They were the cutting edge of civilization, the point of the spear that carved out the boundaries of the known world, the force that made possible the peace and prosperity that would follow in their wake. The empire they served was vast beyond imagination, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, from the Caucasus Mountains to the deserts of Arabia. But it was also fragile, held together by the constant movement of armies like theirs, by the visible demonstration of power that convinced subject peoples that resistance was futile and rebellion doomed. Each march was both a military maneuver and a political statement, each appearance a carefully choreographed reminder of Persian might. Their reputation preceded them into every city, every province, every corner of the known world. Stories of their discipline, their skill, their unwavering loyalty to the King of Kings had become legends that grew in the telling. Children were frightened into obedience with tales of the immortals. Merchants calculated the cost of their passage through trade routes. Governors prepared elaborate welcomes that demonstrated their submission to the imperial will. But the empire they served was just beginning to stretch its reach, not only across deserts and mountains, but into the hearts of ancient cities built long before Persia's rise. Cities of stone and story, of gods and great rivers, places where civilizations had flourished when the Balafing. Persians were still nomads wandering the grasslands with their flocks, and among them, one stood out. A city so vast, so storied, so deeply rooted in legend that it seemed unconquerable. Its walls had been built by gods, according to the stories. Its towers reached toward heaven itself. Its wealth could ransom kingdoms. For centuries, it had stood as the greatest city in the world, the crown jewel of Mesopotamia, the place where the rivers met and the trade routes converged. This was Babylon, the city that had seen empires rise and fall, that had been conquered and reconquered, that had absorbed its conquerors and made them its own. Its ziggurats pierced the sky like man-made mountains. Its palaces sprawled across acres of precious ground. Its streets teemed with peoples from every corner of the known world. It was ancient when Persia was young, sophisticated when the Persian court still bore the dust of nomadic camps. But the Persians did not charge its gates with fury. They arrived with patience, with calculation, with the same methodical precision that had conquered half the world. They understood that some victories could not be won by force alone, that some cities required subtlety rather than strength, that some conquests demanded time rather than violence. And one quiet night, they changed history without a single flaming arrow, without the crash of bronze on bronze, without the screams of dying men echoing off ancient walls. They won Babylon not by destroying it, but by becoming part of it, not by conquering its people, but by convincing them that Persian rule offered something better than continued independence. Let us now drift toward the city of Babylon, where conquest came not with screams, but with silence, where the greatest victory in Persian history was won not by the sword, but by the river that had given the city life for 3,000 years, where patient strategy triumphed over brute force, and where the empire of the Persians proved that sometimes the mightiest victories are those that leave no blood upon the ground. Now that we've walked in the dust behind the immortals, let's shift our gaze to something far more still, yet no less significant. Picture not the chaos of a battlefield, but the eerie quiet of a city that does not resist. Tonight, we turn our attention to the city of Babylon, a place of legend, of ziggurats reaching toward the gods, of hanging gardens maybe, and of a fall so strangely silent it has puzzled historians for centuries. Imagine yourself standing near Babylon's gates in the year 539 BCE. The air is thick with the scent of baked mud brick in open market stalls. The Euphrates River, brown and slow, winds through the city like a coiled serpent. Palm trees sway just outside the walls, their fronds catching the last golden light of evening. You hear the low murmur of priests at a temple, their ancient chants drifting through the warm air like incense. Children laughing, vendors shouting in Akkadian, and the gentle scratch of styluses on clay tablets as scribes record the day's transactions. The sound of water lapping against the keys, the creak of wooden wheels on stone streets, the distant bleating of goats being herded to market. Everything looks normal. Everything sounds normal. The rhythm of life in the greatest city on earth continues its ancient dance, but it's not normal. The Persians are coming. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen, you need to understand what Babylon was in 539 BCE. This wasn't just another city waiting to be conquered. This was the beating heart of civilization itself. For over 1,000 years, Babylon had been synonymous with power, learning, and divine authority. Its name alone could make distant kings tremble. Its wealth was legendary. Its walls were considered impregnable. The city sprawled across both banks of the Euphrates, connected by a magnificent bridge that was itself an engineering marvel. Within those walls lived perhaps 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world. The palace complex alone covered hundreds of acres, its walls decorated with glazed brick reliefs of lions, dragons, and bulls in brilliant blues and yellows that seemed to glow in the Mesopotamian sun. The Ishtar Gate, the city's ceremonial entrance, was a masterpiece of ancient architecture, its surfaces covered in glazed bricks depicting the sacred animals of Marduk and Ishtar. But perhaps most impressive of all was the Esagila, the great temple of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. This wasn't just a religious center, it was the ideological heart of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Here, the king received divine approval for his rule. Here, The fate of nations was supposedly decided by the gods. The temple ziggurat, called Etmananki, rose in 7 stages toward the heavens, each level painted a different color. The Greeks would later call it the Tower of Babel, but to the Babylonians, it was simply the dwelling place of their supreme deity. This was the city that Cyrus the Great set his sights on in 539 BCE. But Cyrus was no ordinary conqueror, and his approach to Babylon would prove that. By the time Cyrus turned his attention to Babylon, he had already established himself as perhaps the most successful ruler of his age. Born around 600 BCE, he had inherited a small kingdom in the highlands of what is now Iran. But through a combination of military genius, diplomatic cunning, and an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty, he had transformed the Persians from a minor tribal confederation into the dominant power in the ancient world. His empire already stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. He had conquered the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Lydia, capturing its king Cyrus, a man whose name had become synonymous with wealth. He had absorbed the Median Empire, turned the Greek cities of Ionia into willing vassals, and brought dozens of smaller kingdoms under Persian rule. But he had done it in a way that was almost unprecedented in the ancient world. Unlike the Assyrians, who had ruled through terror and brutal repression, Cyrus practiced what we might call enlightened conquest. He didn't destroy the cities he captured. He didn't massacre their populations or burn their temples. Instead, he presented himself as a liberator, freeing people from the tyranny of their previous rulers. He respected local customs, honored local gods, and often kept local administrators in positions of authority. It was a revolutionary approach to empire building, and it worked brilliantly. But Babylon presented a special challenge. This wasn't some frontier kingdom that could be absorbed quietly into the Persian sphere of influence. This was the center of Mesopotamian civilization, a city that had never been successfully conquered by a foreign power. Its walls were legendary. Herodotus, writing a century later, claimed they were 56 miles in circumference, 300 feet high, and so wide that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on top of them. Modern archaeology suggests these numbers were exaggerated, but even so, Babylon's defenses were formidable. The outer wall, built by Nebuchadnezzar II, was a double barrier with a wide moat in front. The inner wall was even more impressive, reinforced with towers every 65 feet. The Euphrates River flowed directly through the city, but even here the Babylonians had been clever. Massive bronze gates could be lowered to block the river passage, and the banks were lined with walls that extended below the waterline. A direct assault would have been costly and might well have failed. Even if it succeeded, it would have meant the destruction of the very prize Cyrus sought to claim. The Persian king needed Babylon intact. He needed its temples functioning, its trade networks operating, its scribal schools producing the administrators who kept the ancient world's bureaucracy running. He needed, in short, to conquer Babylon without destroying it. And so he waited. For months, Persian forces surrounded the city, but they made no move to attack. Inside Babylon, life continued much as it always had. King Nabonidus, the last ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, seemed oddly detached from the crisis facing his kingdom. He had spent much of his reign pursuing his passion for archaeology and lunar worship, often neglecting the traditional duties of kingship. His son Belshazzar handled much of the day-to-day administration, but even he seemed unable to fully grasp the existential threat posed by the Persian army camped outside the walls. The Babylonian priesthood was growing increasingly restless. Nabonidus had offended them by elevating the moon god Sin above Marduk, the traditional patron deity of Babylon. This wasn't just a theological dispute. It struck at the very heart of Babylonian identity and legitimacy. The priests controlled vast wealth and wielded enormous influence over the population. Their support was essential for any ruler of Babylon, but Nabonidus had managed to alienate them almost completely. Into this tense situation, Cyrus began to project a very different image of Persian rule. Through emissaries and proclamations, he presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator sent by Marduk himself to restore proper order to Babylon. He promised to honor the traditional gods, respect the ancient customs, and rule through Babylonian law. It was a masterful propaganda campaign, and it began to have its intended effect. But propaganda alone wouldn't open Babylon's gates. For that, Cyrus needed something more direct. There are several versions of what happened next, each colored by the perspective of its author. The Persian version, preserved in the Cyrus cylinder, presents it as a divinely ordained liberation. The Babylonian Chronicle offers a more matter-of-fact account. Greek historians like Herodotus and Xenophon added their own embellishments. But from these various sources, we can piece together the broad outline of one of history's most audacious military operations. The key lay in the Euphrates River. The river flowed directly through Babylon, passing under the great walls through channels protected by bronze gates. These waterways were both Babylon's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. They provided fresh water and a trade route even during a siege, but they also offered a potential path into the city for anyone clever enough to exploit it. Cyrus had studied the river carefully. Upstream from Babylon, the Euphrates flowed through marshy terrain crisscrossed with irrigation canals. If these canals could be opened at the right moment, much of the river's flow could be diverted, dramatically lowering the water level at Babylon. The channel through the city, normally deep enough to prevent passage on foot, might become shallow enough for soldiers to wade through. The plan was audacious in its simplicity, but it required precise timing and absolute secrecy. For weeks, Persian engineers worked upstream, preparing the diversions but not yet opening them. Meanwhile, Persian agents inside Babylon, and there were Persian agents, because Cyrus had been cultivating support among the disaffected priesthood for months, waited for the signal. The night chosen for the operation was during one of Babylon's great festivals, when much of the population would be celebrating, and the guards might be less vigilant. As darkness fell over Mesopotamia, Persian soldiers took their positions along the riverbank outside the city walls. They carried no siege engines, no battering rams, no scaling ladders. They came armed only with swords and the element of surprise. Upstream, the diversions were opened. The effect wasn't immediate. The Euphrates was a large river, and it took time for the water level to drop significantly. But gradually, inexorably, the brown waters began to recede. What had been a flowing river became a series of pools connected by shallow streams. What had been an impassable barrier became a muddy pathway into the heart of Babylon. Persian soldiers, led by officers who had studied the river's course for months, began to make their way into the city. They moved in small groups, wading through knee-deep water, their weapons held high to keep them dry. The bronze gates that should have blocked their passage stood useless above the lowered waterline. The walls that had protected Babylon for centuries were bypassed entirely. It was perhaps 2 or 3 in the morning when the first Persian soldiers emerged from the Euphrates inside Babylon's walls. The city was quiet except for the distant sounds of festival celebrations. Most of the population was asleep or drunk or both. The palace guards, trained to watch for attacks from outside the walls, weren't prepared for an assault that came from within. What happened next depends on which source you trust. Some accounts suggest there was fierce fighting as Babylonian troops tried to repel the invaders. Others claim the city fell almost without resistance, its defenders overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of Persian soldiers where none should have been able to go. The Babylonian Chronicle, our most reliable contemporary source, suggests the truth was somewhere in between. There was some fighting, but it was brief and localized. By dawn, Persian forces controlled the key points of the city: the palace, the main temples, the gates. King Nabonidus was not in Babylon when the city fell. He had been campaigning in the north and was captured later. though he was treated with the respect due a defeated king rather than executed. His son Belshazzar, who had been acting as regent, disappears from the historical record at this point. Later Jewish and Greek sources would claim he was killed during the conquest, but contemporary Babylonian records make no mention of his fate. What is clear is that by October 29, 539 BCE, a date we know precisely from Babylonian astronomical records, Cyrus the Great had entered Babylon in triumph. But this triumph was unlike any the ancient world had seen before. There was no sack of the city, no massacre of the population, no burning of temples or palaces. Instead, Cyrus immediately set about presenting himself as the legitimate successor to the Babylonian kings. He made offerings to Marduk in the great temple of Esagila. He performed the traditional rituals that marked the beginning of a new reign. He issued proclamations in Akkadian, the language of Babylonian administration, promising to respect traditional laws and customs. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in the ruins of Babylon in 1879, preserves his own account of these events. Written in cuneiform on a clay barrel, it presents Cyrus as Marduk's chosen agent, sent to restore justice and order to Babylon. The text claims that Marduk had grown angry with Nabonidus for neglecting the proper worship of the gods, and had searched the world for a righteous king to replace him. That king was Cyrus, who would rule as Marduk's earthly representative. But Cyrus went beyond mere propaganda. He backed up his words with actions that demonstrated a remarkable understanding of how to rule a diverse empire. One of his first acts was to order the return of religious statues that had been brought to Babylon from conquered territories. These statues, representing the gods of dozens of different peoples, were sent back to their original temples with Persian funding for their restoration. Most famously, Cyrus ordered the release of the Jewish exiles who had been deported to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar decades earlier. Not only were they free to return to their homeland, but Cyrus provided funding for the rebuilding of their temple in Jerusalem. He even returned the gold and silver vessels that had been taken from the original temple when Jerusalem was destroyed. This wasn't charity. It was brilliant statecraft. By appearing as a liberator rather than a conqueror, Cyrus earned the loyalty of peoples who might otherwise have spent generations plotting rebellion. The Jews, in particular, became some of his most enthusiastic supporters. The Hebrew Bible portrays Cyrus as a Messiah, an anointed one, chosen by God to free his people from captivity. But Cyrus's tolerance extended far beyond the Jews. Throughout his empire, local customs were respected, local gods were honored, and local elites were incorporated into the Persian administrative system. This wasn't weakness. It was a revolutionary approach to imperial governance. That would become the foundation of Persian success for the next 2 centuries. The conquest of Babylon marked the completion of Cyrus's transformation of the ancient world. With Babylon under Persian control, virtually all of the civilized world from the Aegean Sea to the Indian Ocean was now part of a single empire. Trade routes that had been disrupted by centuries of warfare were reopened. Cultural exchange flourished. The Persian postal system, with its network of roads and relay stations, connected distant parts of the empire more efficiently than ever before. For Babylon itself, Persian rule meant the end of political independence, but not cultural decline. The city remained a major center of learning and commerce. Its astronomical schools continued to produce the most accurate calendars and star charts in the ancient world. Its legal traditions were preserved and incorporated into Persian law. Its merchants continued to trade across the known world, now under the protection of Persian power. The scribal schools of Babylon became training grounds for Persian administrators. Young men from across the empire came to study Akkadian and learn the complex bureaucratic traditions that had governed Mesopotamia for millennia. In this way, Babylonian expertise in administration, law, and record-keeping became the foundation of Persian imperial governance. The temples, too, continued to flourish under Persian patronage. The great ziggurat of Marduk was maintained and restored. The elaborate festivals that marked the Babylonian religious calendar continued as they always had. Persian kings, following Cyrus's example, made regular offerings to Babylonian gods and participated in the traditional ceremonies that legitimized their rule. Yet for all this continuity, something fundamental had changed. Babylon was no longer the center of its own world. It was a provincial capital, albeit an important one, in someone else's empire. The proud independence that had characterized Babylonian civilization for over 1,000 years was gone forever. The psychological impact of this change was perhaps as significant as the political one. For centuries, the Babylonians had seen themselves as the inheritors of the world's oldest civilization. They were the keepers of ancient wisdom, the intermediaries between gods and mortals, the rightful rulers of Mesopotamia. Now they were subjects of nomadic tribesmen from the Iranian highlands. Some Babylonians undoubtedly chafed under foreign rule, however benevolent. There were occasional revolts in later centuries, brutally suppressed by Persian forces. But for the most part, the transition was remarkably smooth. Cyrus's policy of respect for local traditions had created a stable foundation for Persian rule that would endure for 2 centuries. The conquest of Babylon also had profound implications for the broader ancient world. With the fall of the last great Mesopotamian empire, the center of civilization began to shift westward. Greek cities, previously marginal players in international affairs, started to emerge as independent powers. The cultural synthesis that would eventually produce Hellenistic civilization had its roots in the Persian Empire's cosmopolitan mixing of different traditions. The Persian Empire itself was transformed by the conquest of Babylon. The Persians had always been skillful warriors and administrators, but they had lacked the deep cultural traditions that gave legitimacy to imperial rule. By absorbing Babylonian civilization, they gained access to 3,000 years of accumulated wisdom about statecraft, law, religion, and administration. Cyrus himself was changed by the experience. The tribal king who had begun his career, leading raids from the Iranian highlands, had become the ruler of the world's first truly global empire. He had learned to think not just as a conqueror, but as a civilizer, not just as a Persian, but as a universal monarch responsible for the welfare of dozens of different peoples. This transformation would be Cyrus's most lasting legacy. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire 2 centuries later, he consciously modeled himself on Cyrus, adopting the same policy of respect for local customs and incorporation of local elites. When the Romans built their own empire, they drew on Persian precedents as much as Greek ones. The idea of a universal empire that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries, an idea that would shape political thought for the next 2 millennia, was essentially Cyrus's creation. But in the immediate aftermath of Babylon's fall, such grand historical perspectives were far from anyone's mind. The city's inhabitants were more concerned with the practical implications of their new situation. Would trade continue as before? Would the temples receive their traditional support? Would young Babylonians still be able to pursue careers in the royal administration? The answers, it turned out, were largely positive. Persian rule proved to be less disruptive than many had feared. The empire's vast scale actually opened new opportunities for ambitious Babylonians. Young men who might have spent their entire careers as minor officials in the Babylonian bureaucracy could now rise to positions of authority governing distant provinces. Babylonian merchants found new markets opening across the Persian Empire. Babylonian scholars were patronized by Persian kings who valued their expertise. The city itself began to change as well. Persian architectural styles were introduced alongside traditional Babylonian ones. The palace complex was expanded and modernized. New quarters were built to house the growing population of Persian administrators, soldiers, and settlers. Babylon was becoming a truly cosmopolitan city, home to people from across the known world. Yet underneath these changes, the eternal rhythms of Mesopotamian life continued. The Euphrates still flowed brown and slow through the city's heart. The date palms still fruited in their season. The scribes still recorded their transactions on clay tablets, using the cuneiform script that had served their ancestors for 3,000 years. Children still played in the dusty streets, learning the ancient games that had entertained Babylonian children since time immemorial. It was this continuity, perhaps, that made Babylon's conquest so different from the typical pattern of ancient warfare. Usually, the fall of a great city meant its destruction. Buildings were burned, populations were scattered, cultural traditions were lost. But Babylon survived its conquest more or less intact. Its fall was more like a transformation than a destruction. This survival was not accidental. It was the direct result of Cyrus's revolutionary approach to empire building. By choosing absorption over destruction, respect over domination, he had created something new in the world, an empire that grew stronger by incorporating its conquests rather than simply exploiting them. The immediate consequences of this approach were visible throughout Babylon in the months following its conquest. The city's markets remained active, its temples continued their ancient rituals, its schools kept training new generations of scribes and administrators. What had changed was not the substance of Babylonian life, but its context. The city was no longer the center of its own universe, but it remained a vital part of a much larger one. This transition was symbolized by the Persian adoption of Babylonian administrative practices, the complex system of provinces, satrapies, and tribute that would characterize Persian. Imperial administration was based largely on Babylonian precedents. The Persian kings styled themselves as successors to the great Mesopotamian rulers, adopting their titles and performing their ceremonies. Even the Persian royal inscriptions were often written in Akkadian as well as Persian, acknowledging the continued importance of Babylonian culture. For the Jewish exiles, the conquest of Babylon was nothing short of miraculous. After decades in captivity, they were not only free to return home, but were being actively encouraged to do so by their new Persian overlords. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Hebrew Bible describe the joy and excitement of the returning exiles as they began to rebuild their homeland. For them, Cyrus was indeed a Messiah, a deliverer sent by God to end their suffering. But the Jewish experience was just one example of a broader Persian policy that affected dozens of displaced peoples throughout the empire. The Assyrians and Babylonians had often deported conquered populations as a way of preventing rebellion. Cyrus reversed this policy, allowing exiled peoples to return to their homelands while still remaining within the Persian Empire. It was a masterstroke that converted potential enemies into grateful allies. The broader implications of Babylon's fall extended far beyond the borders of the Persian Empire. News of the city's conquest spread quickly throughout the ancient world, carried by merchants and diplomats, soldiers and refugees. In Greece, where city-states were just beginning to assert their independence from Persian influence, the fall of Babylon was seen as proof of Persian invincibility. In Egypt, still clinging to its independence under the pharaohs of the 26th dynasty, the news must have been deeply troubling. For the intellectual and cultural life of the ancient world, the conquest had equally profound implications. Babylon had been one of the great centers of learning for over a millennium. Its libraries contained tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, recording everything from epic poetry to mathematical treatises to astronomical observations. Its schools had trained generations of scribes, priests, and administrators who had spread Mesopotamian culture throughout the known world. Under Persian rule, this intellectual tradition continued, but began to evolve in new directions. Persian scholars worked alongside Babylonian ones, creating a synthesis of different cultural traditions. Greek intellectuals, now living within the Persian Empire, had access to Babylonian wisdom for the first time. The exchange of ideas that resulted from this cultural mixing would eventually produce some of the greatest achievements of ancient civilization. The conquest of Babylon also marked a turning point in the history of religion. For the first time, A single empire encompassed virtually all of the world's major religious traditions. Cyrus's policy of religious tolerance set a precedent that would influence imperial governance for centuries to come. The idea that an empire could be held together by tolerance rather than repression was revolutionary, and its implications would be felt long after the Persian Empire itself had fallen. But tolerance, as implemented by the Persians, was more complex than it might appear to modern eyes. It wasn't simply a matter of live and let live. Rather, it was a sophisticated form of political control that recognized the power of religious belief to either support or undermine imperial authority. By honoring local gods, the Persians were essentially co-opting them into the imperial system. When Cyrus made offerings to Marduk, he wasn't just showing respect. He was claiming divine sanction for Persian rule. This religious diplomacy extended throughout the empire in ways that would have profound consequences for the development of world religions. In Egypt, Persian kings would present themselves as pharaohs, performing the traditional rituals that connected them to the ancient gods of the Nile. In Greece, they would honor Zeus and Apollo. In Judea, they would style themselves as servants of Yahweh. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was statecraft of the highest order. The Babylonian priesthood, initially suspicious of their new overlords, gradually came to appreciate the benefits of Persian rule. The empire's vast wealth allowed for temple renovations on a scale that hadn't been seen for generations. The Esagila was not only maintained but expanded, its ceremonies becoming more elaborate than ever. Persian nobles, eager to demonstrate their piety and secure divine favor, competed to fund ever more magnificent religious festivals. This patronage had an unexpected side effect. It accelerated the development of religious syncretism throughout the empire. As Persian nobles honored foreign gods, as displaced peoples returned to their homelands carrying new religious ideas as merchants, and administrators traveled freely across vast distances, religious traditions began to influence each other in unprecedented ways. The rigid polytheism of earlier periods gave way to more flexible theological systems that could accommodate multiple divine influences. In Babylon, this meant that Marduk's supremacy was maintained, but contextualized within a broader divine hierarchy that included Persian, Egyptian, Greek, and other deities. Temple inscriptions from this period show a remarkable theological sophistication, with priests developing complex theories about how different gods related to each other across cultural boundaries. These intellectual developments would eventually influence the emergence of more universalist religious movements, including early Christianity and later forms of Judaism. The economic implications of Babylon's integration into the Persian Empire were equally far-reaching. The city had always been a major commercial center, but Persian rule opened markets that had previously been inaccessible. Babylonian merchants could now trade freely from the Black Sea to the Indian Ocean, protected by Persian law and facilitated by Persian infrastructure. The famous Royal Road, stretching from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa in Persia, passed through Babylon and transformed it into one of the empire's most important commercial hubs. Caravans arriving from distant provinces brought goods that most Babylonians had never seen before: Chinese silk, Indian spices, African ivory, Scythian gold. The city's markets became showcases for the wealth and diversity of the Persian Empire. This commercial expansion required new forms of financial organization. Babylonian banking houses, already sophisticated by ancient standards, developed new instruments to facilitate long-distance trade. Letters of credit, currency exchange, and commercial partnerships spanning multiple provinces became routine. The Morocco archive, discovered by archaeologists in the 20th century, reveals the complexity of these commercial networks and their integration with imperial administration. But the most significant economic change was the standardization of weights, measures, and currencies across the empire. The Persian daric, minted to exacting standards, became the first truly international currency. A merchant in Babylon could use the same coins in Athens, Memphis, or Bactra. This monetary unification reduced transaction costs and facilitated trade on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the Roman Empire at its height. Cultural consequences of this economic integration were profound. Babylon became a cosmopolitan city in the truest sense, home to people from dozens of different ethnic groups and cultural traditions. Persian administrators lived alongside Babylonian priests. Greek merchants conducted business with Indian traders. Jewish scribes worked in the same archives as Egyptian accountants. This diversity created a vibrant intellectual atmosphere that attracted scholars and artists from across the known world. The famous Library of Babylon, already one of the ancient world's great repositories of knowledge, was expanded under Persian patronage to include texts in multiple languages and scripts. Persian scholars worked to translate important Babylonian works into their own language, while Babylonian scribes learned to read Persian, Aramaic, and other languages essential for imperial administration. The result was an unprecedented exchange of ideas that enriched all the cultures involved. In the decades following the conquest, Babylon gradually adapted to its new role as a Persian provincial capital. The transition was not always smooth. There were occasional tensions between Persian governors and local officials, disputes over taxation and administrative procedures, cultural misunderstandings that sometimes flared into conflict. But overall, the integration was remarkably successful. One source of tension was the Persian practice of moving populations for administrative purposes. While Cyrus had famously allowed exiled peoples to return home, his successors sometimes found it convenient to relocate skilled craftsmen, administrators, or military specialists to areas where their talents were needed. Some Babylonians found themselves appointed to govern distant provinces, an honor that was also an exile from their homeland. These appointments, however, often proved beneficial to both the individuals involved and the empire as a whole. Babylonian administrators brought their sophisticated bureaucratic traditions to provinces that had previously been governed through more informal arrangements. Persian provinces that received Babylonian governors often experienced periods of unprecedented prosperity and stability. The reverse was also true. Persian nobles appointed to govern Babylon often developed deep appreciation for Mesopotamian culture and learning. Some became patrons of Babylonian scholarship, funding astronomical observations or commissioning copies of ancient texts. A few even converted to Babylonian religious practices, though this was more often a matter of political expedience than genuine theological conviction. The most successful Persian governors were those who learned to navigate the complex relationship between imperial authority and local tradition. They understood that effective rule in Babylon required not just military force and administrative efficiency, but also cultural sensitivity and religious legitimacy. The best of them became genuinely bilingual and bicultural, equally at home in Persian and Babylonian contexts. This cultural adaptation went both ways. Babylonian elites who wanted to succeed under Persian rule learned Persian customs, studied Persian law, and cultivated relationships with Persian officials. Some sent their sons to be educated at the Persian court, where they learned not just language and customs, but also the broader perspectives that came with governing a vast, diverse empire. These educational exchanges had lasting consequences for both cultures. Young Babylonians who studied in Persia returned home with new ideas about government, religion, and social organization. Young Persians who studied in Babylon absorbed the intellectual traditions that had developed over 3 millennia of Mesopotamian civilization. The result was a gradual synthesis that enriched both cultures while preserving their distinctive characteristics. The military integration of Babylon into the Persian Empire followed similar patterns. The city's traditional guards were supplemented but not replaced by Persian troops. Babylonian military units were incorporated into the Persian army, often serving in campaigns far from home. This military service provided another avenue for cultural exchange and imperial integration. Babylonian soldiers serving in Persian armies brought their engineering skills to campaigns across the empire. The siege techniques that had been developed in Mesopotamian warfare proved useful in Persian campaigns against Greek cities or Indian fortresses. Conversely, Persian cavalry tactics and archery techniques were adapted for use by Babylonian forces defending their homeland. The Persian postal system, one of the empire's most impressive administrative achievements, revolutionized communication in Babylon and throughout the empire. Messages that had previously taken weeks or months to travel between distant cities could now be delivered in days. This communication revolution had profound implications for both government and commerce. For government, it meant that the Persian king could maintain much closer control over distant provinces than had ever been possible before. Provincial governors received regular instructions from the capital and were expected to provide detailed reports on local conditions. This constant communication helped prevent the kind of regional independence that had plagued earlier empires. For commerce, the postal system facilitated long-distance business relationships that would have been impossible under earlier arrangements. A merchant in Babylon could maintain correspondence with business partners in dozens of cities, coordinating complex transactions across vast distances. The result was an integration of markets that approached the level achieved by modern global commerce. The intellectual life of Babylon flourished under these new conditions. The city's schools and libraries attracted students from across the empire, creating an international community of scholars that exchanged ideas freely across cultural boundaries. Babylonian astronomical observations, already the most sophisticated in the ancient world, were enhanced by Persian royal patronage and by access to observations made in other parts of the empire. The mathematical traditions of Babylon, which had already produced remarkable achievements in algebra and geometry, were stimulated by contact with Persian, Greek, and Indian mathematical systems. Babylonian mathematicians developed new techniques for solving complex problems and began to explore theoretical questions that had no immediate practical applications. This shift toward pure mathematics represented a new phase in the development of Babylonian intellectual culture. Perhaps most importantly, the integration of Babylon into the Persian Empire created conditions that would eventually give rise to new forms of historical consciousness. For the first time, scholars had access to the historical traditions of multiple civilizations and could begin to develop comparative perspectives on historical development. This broader historical vision would eventually influence Greek historiography and contribute to the development of more sophisticated forms of historical analysis. The Persian period also saw important developments in Babylonian literature and religious thought. The ancient epic traditions were preserved and transmitted, but they were also reinterpreted in light of contemporary political realities. New literary works appeared that reflected the cosmopolitan character of imperial Babylon, incorporating themes and motifs from multiple cultural traditions. Religious thought underwent similar developments. While traditional Babylonian theology was maintained, it was also expanded to accommodate new theological questions raised by contact with other religious systems. Babylonian priests developed more sophisticated theories about the relationship between different gods and began to explore questions about divine justice and cosmic order that reflected the complexity of governing a diverse empire. The archaeological record from Persian period Babylon reveals the material dimensions of these cultural changes. Excavations have uncovered artifacts that reflect the city's new cosmopolitan character. Persian seals alongside Babylonian ones, Greek pottery mixed with local ceramics, Egyptian amulets found in Babylonian houses. The city's architecture also reflects this cultural mixing, with Persian building techniques and decorative motifs incorporated into traditional Babylonian structures. The palace complex, expanded and renovated under Persian rule, became a showcase for imperial art and architecture. Persian sculptors and painters worked alongside Babylonian craftsmen to create decorative programs that celebrated both Persian imperial power and Babylonian cultural achievement. The result was a distinctive artistic synthesis that influenced architectural and artistic development throughout the empire. The residential quarters of Babylon also changed during this period. New neighborhoods were built to house the growing population of Persian administrators, soldiers, and settlers. These areas were laid out according to Persian urban planning principles, but incorporated Babylonian building techniques and materials. The result was a distinctive urban landscape that reflected the city's dual character as both a Babylonian cultural center and a Persian administrative capital. The transformation of Babylon under Persian rule represented more than just political conquest. It was a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be civilized in the ancient world. The old model of civilization as something that radiated outward from a single cultural center was replaced by a new model that emphasized cultural exchange and synthesis across vast distances. This new model would have profound implications for the future development of Western civilization. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire 2 centuries later, he inherited not just Persian political structures, but also Persian ideas about cultural tolerance and integration. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's conquests would continue and develop these Persian innovations, creating a Mediterranean world that was more culturally diverse and intellectually sophisticated than anything that had existed before. The Roman Empire, in turn, would build on Hellenistic precedents to create an even more extensive system of cultural integration. The Roman concept of citizenship, which eventually extended to all free inhabitants of the empire, regardless of their ethnic or cultural background, had its roots in Persian innovations that were first implemented in cities like Babylon. But in the immediate aftermath of Babylon's conquest, such grand historical perspectives were still far in the future. The city's inhabitants were more concerned with adapting to their new circumstances and making the most of the opportunities that Persian rule provided. They were creating, day by day, a new form of civilized life that honored the past while embracing the future. Yet even as political structures changed and administrative systems evolved, even as new peoples arrived and new customs took root, the essential character of Babylon endured. The city remained what it had always been, a place where human ambition reached toward the divine, where the practical needs of daily life intersected with the grandest dreams of what civilization might become. The ziggurat of Marduk still rose in 7-colored stages toward the heavens, its summit lost in the morning mist that rose from the Euphrates. The great gates still bore their images of lions and dragons, though now they were flanked by Persian guards, as well as Babylonian ones. The scribal schools still taught young men to press cuneiform characters into clay tablets, though now they learned Persian and Aramaic alongside Akkadian. In the markets, the voices of merchants calling their wares created a polyglot symphony. That would have been impossible in the old days, when Babylon was the center of a more limited world. Egyptian traders haggled with Scythian horse dealers. Indian gem merchants examined Persian textiles. Greek philosophers debated with Babylonian astronomers about the nature of the cosmos and the movement of the stars. The temples, too, reflected this new diversity. While Marduk remained supreme, his worship now incorporated elements from across the Persian Empire. Prayers were offered in multiple languages. Sacrifices were made according to customs drawn from different traditions. Festivals celebrated both ancient Babylonian holidays and newer observances that honored the gods of other peoples. This religious synthesis was not without its tensions. Conservative priests sometimes objected to innovations that seemed to dilute traditional practices. Younger clergy, educated in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Persian Babylon, sometimes pushed for changes that their elders found disturbing. But overall, the theological creativity that emerged from these tensions enriched Babylonian religious life in ways that would have been impossible under the old, more insular system. The intellectual life of the city was similarly transformed. The ancient libraries were expanded to include texts in languages that most Babylonians had never heard of a generation earlier. Sanskrit mathematical treatises were translated into Akkadian. Persian epic poetry was adapted for Babylonian audiences. Greek philosophical texts were studied alongside traditional Mesopotamian wisdom literature. This scholarly activity was not merely academic. The practical demands of governing a vast, diverse empire required new forms of knowledge and new ways of organizing information. Babylonian scribes developed innovative filing systems to keep track of correspondence from dozens of provinces. They created new legal codes that could accommodate the customs of different peoples. They designed administrative procedures that could function effectively across vast distances and cultural differences. The astronomical schools of Babylon, already renowned throughout the ancient world, found their work taking on new significance under Persian rule. The empire's vast extent meant that accurate calendars and reliable navigation techniques were more important than ever. Babylonian astronomers worked with their Persian colleagues to create star charts that could be used from the Aegean Sea to the Indian Ocean. Their mathematical techniques for predicting celestial events were refined and disseminated throughout the empire. But perhaps the most remarkable development was in the realm of what we might call anthropological observation. For the first time in human history, scholars had systematic access to information about dozens of different cultures and ways of life. Babylonian intellectuals began to develop comparative studies of law, religion, and social organization that represented a new form of social science. These studies revealed both the diversity of human culture and its underlying unity. Different peoples might worship different gods, speak different languages, and organize their societies in different ways, but they all faced similar challenges and developed similar solutions to fundamental human problems. This recognition of both human diversity and human unity would eventually contribute to the development of more sophisticated philosophical and ethical systems. The arts, too, flourished in this cosmopolitan environment. Persian and Babylonian artistic traditions merged to create new forms of expression that reflected the complexity and sophistication of imperial culture. Palace decorations incorporated motifs from across the empire, creating visual narratives that celebrated both Persian power and the diversity of Persian subjects. Music became particularly important as a means of cultural expression and integration. Persian court musicians learned to play Babylonian instruments and sing Babylonian songs. Babylonian musicians, in turn, mastered Persian musical forms and began to incorporate them into their own compositions. The result was a rich musical synthesis that influenced artistic development throughout the empire. The textile arts also reflected this cultural mixing. Babylonian weavers, working with silk from China, cotton from India, and wool from the Persian highlands, created fabrics that were both beautiful and symbolic of the empire's vast reach. Persian nobles wore robes that incorporated Babylonian designs, while Babylonian priests donned vestments that reflected Persian color preferences and decorative motifs. Even cuisine reflected the city's new cosmopolitan character. The spice trade, now facilitated by Persian infrastructure and security, brought new flavors to Babylonian tables. Cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, and saffron from Persia transformed traditional Mesopotamian cooking. Persian nobles introduced their own culinary traditions, while Babylonian cooks adapted their recipes to accommodate new ingredients and new tastes. This cultural flowering was not merely ornamental. It reflected and reinforced the political and economic integration that made the Persian Empire so remarkably stable and prosperous. By creating a shared imperial culture that honored diversity while promoting unity, the Persians solved one of the fundamental problems of empire building: how to maintain control over vast territories and diverse populations without resorting to constant military coercion. The key to this success was the recognition that cultural exchange was not a threat to political stability, but rather its foundation. When people from different backgrounds could communicate effectively, trade profitably, and worship freely, they had powerful incentives to support the imperial system that made such opportunities possible. The alternative, a return to the fragmented, warring kingdoms of the pre-Persian period, offered nothing but chaos and suffering. This lesson would not be lost on future empire builders. Alexander the Great, when he conquered the Persian Empire, consciously adopted Persian methods of cultural integration and even married Persian noblewomen to cement political alliances. The Roman Empire, at its height, would create an even more extensive system of cultural synthesis, allowing people from Britain to Mesopotamia to participate in a shared civilization while maintaining their local identities. But the immediate impact of these developments was felt most strongly in Babylon itself, where the daily life of the city reflected the broader transformation of the ancient world. In the streets and markets, in the temples and schools, in the palaces and private homes, people were creating new forms of civilized life that would influence human development for centuries to come. The children growing up in Persian Babylon inhabited a world that would have been unimaginable to their grandparents. They learned to speak multiple languages as a matter of course. They played with toys that came from distant lands and ate foods that previous generations had never tasted. They heard stories that drew on traditions from across the civilized world and dreamed, dreams that were not limited by the horizons of a single culture. These children would grow up to be the administrators, merchants, soldiers, and scholars who would carry Persian civilization to its greatest heights. They would govern provinces from Egypt to India, establish trade routes that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific, and create works of art and literature that would inspire admiration for millennia to come. Yet for all their cosmopolitan sophistication, they would remain, in some essential way, Babylonian. The great city on the Euphrates had given them their first understanding of what it meant to be civilized, and that understanding would shape everything they did for the rest of their lives. In this way, Babylon's influence would extend far beyond its political boundaries, far beyond the lifetime of the Persian Empire, far beyond the memory of Cyrus the Great himself. The city that had surrendered without a battle would prove to be unconquerable in the deepest sense. Its ideas, its institutions, its ways of understanding the world would spread throughout the Persian Empire and beyond, carried by the very people who had conquered it. In losing its political independence, Babylon had gained a different kind of immortality. The key to this success was Cyrus's insight that lasting conquest required not just military victory, but cultural accommodation. By respecting Babylonian traditions while gradually introducing Persian ones, he created a stable foundation for imperial rule that would endure for generations. The city that had fallen without a battle would remain peaceful under foreign rule for 2 centuries. Yet even as life in Babylon settled into new patterns under Persian administration, the city retained its power to fascinate and inspire. Its great buildings still dominated the skyline. Its walls still cast long shadows at dusk. Its temples still echoed with the prayers of worshippers who had come from across the empire to honor the ancient gods of Mesopotamia. And there was one aspect of Babylon that captured imaginations more than any political arrangement or military conquest ever could. It wasn't carved in stone or recorded in royal decrees. It may not have existed at all, at least not in the form that later generations imagined. But the story persisted, passed down through centuries of telling and retelling, embellished and transformed, until it became one of the most enduring legends of the ancient world. It was the story of a garden that defied the desert, a place where water climbed impossible heights, where exotic plants from distant lands grew in perfect harmony, where the harsh realities of Mesopotamian geography were transformed into an earthly paradise. A garden built not for practical purposes, but for love, homesickness, and the all-too-human desire to create beauty in an often ugly world. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Were they real? Were they a product of later imagination? Did they exist in some form that was gradually transformed by the storytelling tradition into something far grander than the original? As Persian rule settled over Babylon, and the city began its long transformation from independent capital to imperial province, these questions remained unanswered. But the very persistence of the legend suggests something important about the power of human imagination to transform reality, to find beauty even in conquest, to create meaning from the raw materials of history. Let's leave the parade grounds and palace walls behind for now. Step away from the political calculations and military strategies that brought down an empire, and venture into a realm where history and legend intertwine, where the line between fact and fiction becomes delightfully blurred. Let's explore the mystery of the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and ask ourselves whether this marvel ever truly existed, or whether it represents something even more remarkable: the eternal human desire to imagine paradise in the midst of an imperfect world. Imagine standing in the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, where the air is dry and the ground bakes beneath a relentless sun. Dust clings to everything. The river cools the edges of the city, but inland, the walls shimmer with heat. The horizon wavers like a mirage, and the very stones seem to exhale the accumulated warmth of countless scorching days. Your sandals scrape against packed earth that has forgotten the touch of rain. The wind, when it comes, carries not relief but more dust, gritty particles that find their way into your eyes, your mouth, between your teeth. This is Mesopotamia as it was, as it has always been. A land of extremes, where civilization first took root, not in spite of the harsh conditions, but perhaps because of them. Where the struggle against the elements forced innovation, cooperation, the careful management of precious water. Where every green thing was fought for, planned for, treasured. Now, picture turning a corner and entering a courtyard unlike any other. The transformation is so sudden, so complete, that for a moment you wonder if you've stepped through some invisible threshold into another realm entirely. The oppressive heat doesn't vanish, but it retreats, held at bay by something impossible. Cool air moves against your skin. Shadows fall in gentle patterns across stone that should be burning hot, but feels pleasantly cool beneath your touch. Vines dangle from stone arches, their leaves rustling with the faintest breeze, creating a soft percussion that seems to quiet the harsh sounds of the city beyond. Palms stretch toward the sky, their fronds creating a canopy that filters the brutal sunlight into dappled patterns of gold and green. Water gurgles gently through narrow channels carved into the floor, the sound so unexpected in this arid place that it seems almost musical. The water catches the light as it moves, throwing tiny reflections onto the surrounding walls like scattered jewels. There are blooming lily, their petals pristine, white and yellow, impossible in their perfection. Flowering almond trees reach toward the light, their branches heavy with blossoms that seem to glow in the filtered sunlight. Maybe there are roses too, though no one can agree. Some accounts speak of jasmine, others of exotic plants brought from distant lands. The very uncertainty adds to the magic, the sense that this place exists at the very edge of possibility. The stone is damp to the touch, cool in a way that seems to defy every law of this sun-scorched land. Water seeps slowly through carefully engineered channels, creating a microclimate that transforms stone and earth into something approaching paradise. You are surrounded by greenery where there should be none, by the sound of running water where drought should reign supreme, by the scent of growing things where dust should dominate every breath. This is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, or at least what they were said to be. This is the vision that has captivated minds for over 2 millennia, a dream of impossible beauty rising from the harsh realities of ancient Mesopotamia. And yet, here's where the story takes its most mysterious turn. No one has ever found them. That's the mystery that has puzzled archaeologists, historians, and dreamers alike. The Hanging Gardens were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, listed alongside monuments we know existed. The pyramids of Giza still stand today, weathered but unmistakable. The ruins of the Colossus of Rhodes have been located, even if the great statue itself has long since fallen. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus has yielded its foundations to excavation, but the Hanging Gardens remain stubbornly absent from the archaeological record. Writers from Greece and Rome described them in detail that should have made them impossible to lose. Strabo, the great geographer, wrote of terraces rising like steps toward the sky, each level thick with earth and planted with trees so large that their trunks required multiple men to encircle them. Diodorus Siculus described an engineering marvel of stone and bitumen, waterproof chambers that could support not just soil and plants, but entire groves of fruit trees. Quintus Curtius wrote of an artificial mountain, green and living, rising from the flat plains of Babylon like something from a fever dream. The structure was said to be a marvel of engineering, beyond anything attempted before or since. Terraced levels rose in careful gradation, each one designed to receive precisely the right amount of sunlight and water. The irrigation system was described as a wonder in itself, with water lifted from the Euphrates River through a complex system of screws, pumps, and channels. Some accounts speak of bronze mechanisms, others of hidden reservoirs fed by underground aqueducts. The engineering required would have been staggering, demanding not just massive resources, but innovations in hydraulics that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. It was supposedly built by King Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BCE, one of the most powerful rulers in Babylonian history. The motivation, according to legend, was deeply personal. His wife, Amadis of Media, came from the green hills and mountains of her homeland. In the flat, brown expanses of Mesopotamia, she grew melancholy, longing for the verdant landscapes of her youth. So the king, in an act of love that seemed to challenge the very gods, decided to bring her homeland to her. He would build mountains where there were none, create forests in the desert, make rivers flow uphill if necessary. An act of love, carved from stone and water, an impossible effort. But here's where the mystery deepens. Babylon's own records, meticulous in their detail about nearly every aspect of civic life, say nothing about them. Nothing at all. This silence is deeply puzzling. The Babylonians were obsessive record keepers, documenting everything from grain shipments to temple repairs with a thoroughness that modern accountants would admire. Clay tablets by the thousands have been recovered from Babylonian sites, recording contracts, inventories, building projects, and administrative minutiae that span centuries of the empire's existence. No detail was too small to escape their notice. The construction of a new gate, the repair of a warehouse, the assignment of workers to various projects, all found their way into the permanent record. No inscriptions mention the gardens. No murals depict them. No administrative logs list gardeners or water engineers assigned to their maintenance. No royal proclamations boast of their construction. No tax records account for their enormous cost. Babylonian texts, so meticulous about every temple and warehouse, every shipment of grain or building project, remain utterly silent about what should have been the greatest construction project in the city's history. Consider what this silence means. The gardens, as described, would have required armies of workers, specialists in hydraulic engineering, botanical experts to select and care for exotic plants, and ongoing maintenance that would have rivaled a small city in its complexity. The water alone would have been a constant concern, requiring not just the initial engineering marvel, but daily attention to pumps, channels, and the delicate balance needed to keep such a system functioning. Yet none of this vast enterprise appears anywhere in the historical record of the people who supposedly built it. The materials described would have been enormously expensive. Stone was rare in Mesopotamia, usually imported at great cost from distant quarries. Bitumen for waterproofing was valuable, carefully managed and accounted for in construction projects. Exotic plants would have required expeditions to foreign lands, negotiations with distant rulers, and the delicate work of transporting living specimens across hundreds of miles of desert. The bronze mechanisms described for lifting water would have represented a fortune in precious metal. Yet none of these expenses appear in any surviving economic records. So what happened? How can something so grand, so thoroughly documented by outside observers, leave no trace in the records of its creators? Several theories have emerged, each more intriguing than the last. Did the gardens exist, but get lost to time in ways we haven't yet understood? The first possibility is that they were real magnificent, and somehow managed to disappear so completely that no trace remains. This isn't as impossible as it might seem. Babylon itself suffered numerous conquests and destructions over the centuries. When the Persians conquered the city, they might have dismantled the gardens out of spite or simple practicality. Later rulers might have found the enormous maintenance costs prohibitive and allowed the system to fail. Without constant attention, the delicate hydraulic systems would have broken down quickly. The plants would have died, the wooden supports rotted, the stone been quarried away for other projects. The Euphrates River has shifted its course multiple times over the millennia, potentially burying entire districts of ancient Babylon under layers of silt. Modern Baghdad sits partly atop the ancient city, making comprehensive excavation impossible. The gardens could lie beneath modern buildings, under shifted riverbeds, or in areas that haven't been thoroughly explored. The absence of evidence, in other words, might not be evidence of absence. Or were they never in Babylon at all? This is where the mystery takes a fascinating turn. Some scholars now believe that the Greeks, who wrote many of the descriptions centuries after the gardens were supposedly built, made a crucial geographical error. They confused Babylon with another great city, Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, located further north along the Tigris River. This theory gains compelling support from archaeological evidence. In the ruins of Nineveh, excavations have revealed an elaborate irrigation system that matches many of the ancient descriptions. Aqueducts carried water from distant mountains. Terraced architecture created artificial hills within the city. Most intriguingly, carved panels have been discovered that depict trees planted on rooftops and artificial gardens integrated into palace architecture. One relief shows King Sennacherib's palace garden, complete with pavilions surrounded by elaborate landscaping and exotic trees. The engineering at Nineveh was certainly capable of supporting the kind of construction described in the ancient accounts. The Assyrians were master builders, their palaces decorated with detailed reliefs that show sophisticated understanding of hydraulics and landscape architecture. King Sennacherib, who ruled in the early 7th century BCE, was particularly known for his building projects and his interest in gardens and water management. His inscriptions actually do mention elaborate gardens, artificial mountains, and engineering works that brought water from great distances. The confusion might have been understandable. Both cities were legendary centers of Mesopotamian power. Both were eventually destroyed, and both were sources of wonder stories that grew in the telling. To later Greek and Roman writers, working from accounts that were already centuries old, the distinction between Babylon and Nineveh might have blurred. The gardens of Sennacherib in Nineveh could have been attributed to Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon through simple historical confusion. But there's another possibility that might be even more compelling. Maybe the gardens did exist in Babylon after all, but were built with materials that the harsh environment eventually consumed entirely. In a land with few stones, mud brick was the standard building material. Mixed with straw and baked in the sun, mud brick could create impressive structures, but it returned to dust with disturbing ease once maintenance ceased. If the gardens were built primarily from mud brick and timber, rather than the stone described in later accounts, they could have disappeared almost completely. Wood rots, especially in the alternating wet and dry cycles of Mesopotamian seasons. Mud brick dissolves back into earth when exposed to rain and flooding. Bitumen, while durable, becomes brittle with age and temperature changes. A garden complex built from these materials might leave only the faintest traces. Some unusual soil composition, fragments of water channels, perhaps patterns in the earth visible only to ground-penetrating radar. The later Greek and Roman writers, working from accounts passed down through multiple generations, might have translated the marvel they heard, described into the materials they knew best. Stone seemed more permanent, more fitting for a wonder of the world, more likely to have survived the centuries. The reality might have been both more practical and more ephemeral. This theory gained support from what we know about Babylonian construction techniques. The famous Ishtar Gate, one of Babylon's most impressive surviving monuments, was built from glazed brick rather than stone. The Hanging Gardens might have used similar techniques, carefully engineered brick and timber structures that created the necessary terraces and water channels, but which time and neglect eventually reclaimed. The Euphrates River adds another layer of complexity to the mystery. Rivers in Mesopotamia have shifted course repeatedly over the millennia, sometimes dramatically. Ancient riverbeds have been buried under layers of silt and new channels carved through what was once dry land. If the gardens were built near the river, as would have been logical for their water supply, they might now lie beneath the modern Euphrates or under the accumulated sediment of centuries of floods. Archaeological techniques are constantly improving, and areas of ancient Babylon that seemed thoroughly explored decades ago are yielding new discoveries as technology advances. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and new methods of chemical analysis might yet reveal traces of the gardens where previous excavations found nothing. But then there's the most intriguing possibility of all, that the gardens were simply imagined, not fabricated maliciously, not invented from whole cloth as some sort of deliberate deception, but idealized over time through the natural process by which stories grow and change in their telling. A small, real courtyard expanded by rumor, then preserved in scrolls and recitations. A memory that grew taller, greener, more magical with each telling. This process wouldn't have been unique or unusual. The ancient world was full of such slow exaggerations, stories that began with kernels of truth and blossomed into legends through repetition and embellishment. A well-placed garden became a mountain of greenery. A clever irrigation trick became a miracle of engineering that defied natural law. A king's love for his wife became an architectural poem written in stone and water. Consider how this might have happened. Nebuchadnezzar II certainly had palace gardens. Such features were common in royal residences throughout Mesopotamia. These gardens might have been impressive for their time, incorporating some innovative irrigation techniques and exotic plants brought from conquered territories. Visitors would have been struck by the contrast between the harsh environment outside and the green oasis within the palace walls. As these visitors returned to their home cities and told others what they had seen, the stories would naturally grow in the telling. Human nature tends to emphasize the most impressive aspects of any experience, and memory has a way of enhancing wonder over time. A garden that seemed remarkably lush in reality might become impossibly verdant in recollection. Clever engineering becomes miraculous technology. A touching gesture of royal affection becomes an epic monument to love. Over generations, as the stories passed from Greek travelers to Roman historians to medieval chroniclers, each retelling might have added new details, enhanced existing ones, or combined elements from multiple different gardens into a single, impossibly magnificent whole. The result would be a literary creation that captured something true about human longing and possibility, even if it never existed in precisely the form described. This interpretation gains support from patterns we see in other ancient wonder stories. Many of the 7 wonders of the ancient world have been embellished in their descriptions beyond what archaeological evidence suggests was actually possible. The Colossus of Rhodes, while certainly impressive, probably wasn't quite as impossibly large as some accounts suggest. The Lighthouse of Alexandria was magnificent, but some of the more fantastical details about its height and the distance from which its light could be seen were almost certainly exaggerated. The process of mythologization was natural and unconscious. People wanted these stories to be as wonderful as possible. Each generation of storytellers was competing, in a sense, with the marvels of their own time, so the ancient wonders had to become more impressive to maintain their status as objects of awe. But if that's the case, if the gardens were largely or entirely mythical, why did the story resonate so deeply? Why has this particular legend maintained its power over human imagination for more than 2,000 years? Perhaps because it spoke to a longing that transcended empires, that reached beyond the specific circumstances of ancient Mesopotamia into something fundamental about human nature. The idea that amid the harshness of conquest, the dust of war, and the cold stone of temples, someone paused to plant a garden. That even kings, with armies at their backs and the power to reshape the world through violence, chose instead to build something delicate, something beautiful, something utterly useless except for the joy it brought. In a world defined by conquest and power, by the harsh necessities of survival in an unforgiving environment, the hanging gardens represented a different kind of strength. Not the strength of bronze and iron, of siege engines and disciplined troops, but the strength required to make beauty for its own sake. The power not to destroy, but to create, not to conquer nature, but to work with it, coaxing life from stone and water where life seemed impossible. The gardens, real or imagined, embodied a vision of what human civilization could be at its best. They suggested that the ultimate expression of power wasn't the ability to destroy enemies or build monuments to military victory, but the capacity to create spaces of peace and beauty. They implied that true kingship meant not just ruling over people, but caring for them in the most fundamental way, by creating environments where life could flourish. This vision was particularly powerful because it emerged from Mesopotamia, a region that had seen centuries of warfare, where empires rose and fell with brutal regularity, where the strong typically prevailed over the weak through force of arms. The idea that a king might build gardens instead of fortresses, that resources might be devoted to beauty instead of war, represented a radical reimagining of what power could mean. The story also captured something essential about love, about the lengths to which human beings will go to make the people they care about happy. Nebuchadnezzar's legendary motivation, his desire to ease his wife's homesickness by recreating her homeland in his own, spoke to the universal experience of wanting to give impossible gifts to those we love. Who hasn't wished they could reshape reality to bring joy to someone important to them? The gardens thus became a symbol of several kinds of human greatness simultaneously: the triumph of engineering and innovation, the power of love to inspire seemingly impossible acts, and the vision of civilization as something more than mere survival or conquest. They represented the idea that humans, at their best, are builders not just of cities and empires, but of beauty and wonder. This symbolism becomes even more powerful when we consider the context in which these stories emerged and persisted. The ancient world was not a gentle place. Life was precarious, death was commonplace, and survival required constant vigilance against human enemies and natural disasters alike. In such a world, the decision to devote enormous resources to something as ephemeral as a garden would have seemed almost incomprehensible to practical minds. Yet that apparent impracticality was precisely what made the gardens so compelling as a story. They represented a kind of magnificent excess, a willingness to go beyond mere necessity into the realm of pure delight. In societies where most people struggled to meet basic needs, where famines were regular occurrences, and clean water was a precious commodity, the image of a king using vast quantities of both to create something beautiful, rather than useful, spoke to deep human longings for a world where such choices were possible. The gardens also embodied a particular vision of the relationship between humanity and nature, rather than simply conquering the natural world or accepting its limitations. The gardens suggested a third path: partnership. The engineering required would have demanded intimate understanding of how water moves, how plants grow, how soil composition affects drainage and nutrition. This wasn't the group domination of nature through force, but a delicate collaboration that required listening to natural processes and working with them rather than against them. This aspect of the legend may explain why it has continued to resonate through periods of history, when humanity's relationship with the natural world has become increasingly fraught. As we've developed the technological power to reshape environments on a massive scale, often with destructive consequences. The image of the hanging gardens offers an alternative model. Human ingenuity applied not to exploit nature, but to enhance it, to create spaces where both human and natural beauty can flourish together. The story also carries profound implications about the nature of true wealth and power. Nebuchadnezzar II was already one of the most powerful rulers in the ancient world. He commanded vast armies, controlled crucial trade routes, and ruled over cities whose wealth was legendary. Yet, according to the legend, his greatest achievement wasn't a military victory or a monument to his own glory, but a gift to his wife. The gardens suggested that the ultimate luxury wasn't gold or precious stones, but the ability to reshape reality itself out of love. This transformation of power from an instrument of domination into an expression of care represents one of the most radical aspects of the garden legend. In a world where strength was typically measured by one's ability to destroy enemies and conquer territories, the gardens proposed a different metric: the capacity to create environments where others could flourish. The king's power was validated not by the fear he inspired, but by the joy he could bring to someone he loved. The technical challenges described in the ancient accounts also speak to human fascination with problems that seem impossible to solve. The hydraulic engineering alone would have required innovations that pushed the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. Water had to be lifted from the river level to heights that would have challenged even modern pumping systems. The weight of soil, trees, and water on artificial terraces would have required structural engineering of extraordinary sophistication. Some accounts describe the use of Archimedes' screw to lift water, though this device was supposedly invented centuries later. Other sources mention complex systems of pumps and reservoirs, hidden chambers that could store water during dry periods, and channels that could distribute moisture evenly across different levels of the garden. The precision required for such a system would have been staggering. Too little water, and the plants would die. Too much, and the structure itself might collapse under the weight. The botanical challenges would have been equally daunting. Different plants require different amounts of sunlight, water, and soil depth. Creating an environment where trees, shrubs, and flowering plants could all thrive together would have required careful planning and ongoing adjustment. The microclimate created by the garden would have affected wind patterns, humidity levels, and temperature variations throughout the structure. Moreover, many of the plants described in ancient accounts weren't native to Mesopotamia. Bringing exotic species from distant lands would have required not just initial transportation, but ongoing knowledge of their specific needs. Ancient gardeners would have needed to understand concepts that wouldn't be formally recognized by botany for centuries: soil pH, nutrient cycling, symbiotic relationships between different plant species. The maintenance requirements alone would have been extraordinary. Such a system wouldn't have been self-sustaining. It would have required daily attention from skilled workers who understood both the mechanical and biological aspects of the garden's operation. Pumps would need repair, channels would require cleaning, plants would need pruning and replacement. The ongoing cost in labor and materials would have rivaled that of maintaining a small army. Yet despite these overwhelming practical challenges, or perhaps because of them, the story of the gardens captured something essential about human ambition. They represented the willingness to attempt the impossible, to commit resources and energy to projects that existed at the very edge of feasibility. In this sense, they belong to the same category of human achievement as the pyramids, the great cathedrals, or the space program. Endeavors that seemed to make little practical sense, but spoke to something fundamental about human nature's refusal to accept limitations. The gardens also embodied a particular kind of optimism about human capability. They suggested that with sufficient knowledge, determination, and resources, even the most fundamental constraints of geography and climate could be overcome. This wasn't hubris in the sense of challenging the gods, but confidence in human ingenuity applied to problems that seemed impossible. This optimism becomes particularly poignant when we consider what happened to Babylon itself. The city that supposedly housed these impossible gardens eventually fell into decline and was gradually abandoned. The mighty Euphrates shifted its course, trade routes moved elsewhere, and the political center of Mesopotamia relocated. The urban civilization that had seemed so permanent, so capable of reshaping the natural world to its will, proved to be as ephemeral as the gardens themselves. Yet the story survived even when the city did not. Long after Babylon's streets were empty, and its buildings had crumbled back into the earth from which they came, people continued to tell stories about the impossible gardens. The physical reality might have been temporary, but the vision it represented proved more durable than stone or bronze. This persistence points to another layer of meaning in the garden legend. Perhaps they represented not just a historical achievement, real or imagined, but a recurring human dream that each generation must discover anew. The specific details of Nebuchadnezzar's gardens might fade, but the underlying longing they represented, the desire to create beauty that transcends necessity, continues to inspire new attempts at the impossible. We see echoes of the Hanging Gardens in every ambitious landscape project, every attempt to create artificial environments that enhance human life. The great gardens of Renaissance Italy, the elaborate water features of Versailles, the urban parks movement of the 19th century, even modern experiments in vertical farming and green architecture all partake in some way of the same vision that supposedly inspired the original gardens. The legend also carries forward a particular understanding of leadership that remains relevant across cultures and centuries. The image of Nebuchadnezzar creating something beautiful for his wife's happiness suggests that true authority includes the responsibility to care for others' emotional and spiritual well-being, not just their physical safety or material prosperity. This model of leadership as service, as the creation of conditions where others can flourish, offers an alternative to purely transactional or domination-based approaches to power. The cross-cultural appeal of the garden story may also reflect its embodiment of values that transcend specific historical contexts. The respect for nature, the celebration of human ingenuity, the priority given to beauty and emotional well-being, the vision of love as a creative force capable of reshaping reality, these themes resonate across different societies and time periods because they address fundamental aspects of human experience. In our own era, as we grapple with environmental challenges that require both technological innovation and a fundamental rethinking of humanity's relationship with the natural world, the Hanging Gardens offer a particularly relevant model. They suggest the possibility of human intervention in natural systems that enhances rather than degrades ecological relationships. They point toward technologies that work with natural processes rather than against them, that create abundance rather than scarcity, that demonstrate care rather than exploitation. Whether the gardens were real or not, they became a symbol of a different kind of power. Not the power of spears and sieges, but of water coaxed uphill through human ingenuity. Not the power of destruction, but of shade made from skill and patience. Not the power of fear, but of beauty built by hands guided by love rather than fire and sword. The enduring fascination with the gardens also reflects humanity's complex relationship with the concept of paradise. In cultures around the world, the vision of an ideal garden appears repeatedly as a symbol of perfect harmony between human desires and natural abundance. The Garden of Eden, the Islamic Gardens of Paradise, the Celtic Otherworld, the Chinese Peach Blossom Spring all share certain features with the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They are places where beauty and bounty exist without struggle, where the harsh realities of survival are temporarily suspended, where human beings can exist in perfect harmony with their environment. What makes the Hanging Gardens unique among these paradise visions is their explicitly human origin. Unlike the Garden of Eden, which was a divine creation from which humans were eventually expelled, or the mythical gardens of the afterlife that exist beyond mortal reach, the Hanging Gardens were supposedly built by human hands in the real world. They represented paradise not as something lost or eternally deferred, but as something that human beings could actually create for themselves and each other. This distinction is crucial to understanding why the story has maintained such power over the human imagination. The gardens suggested that the gap between the world as it is and the world as we might wish it to be could be bridged not through divine intervention or escape to some other realm, but through human creativity, determination, and love. They proposed that paradise was not a place we might eventually reach, but a condition we could create wherever we found ourselves. The story also carries forward certain assumptions about the relationship between individual will and collective achievement. While the gardens are always described as Nebuchadnezzar's creation, motivated by his love for his wife, their construction would have required the cooperation of hundreds or thousands of workers: engineers, architects, skilled craftsmen, laborers, botanists, and ongoing maintenance staff. The gardens thus represent both the power of individual vision and the necessity of collective effort in bringing ambitious dreams to reality. This tension between individual inspiration and collaborative execution reflects a fundamental paradox in human achievement. The greatest projects, whether real or legendary, typically require both the driving force of individual commitment and the specialized knowledge and labor of many people working together. The gardens embody this paradox. They are remembered as one man's gift to his wife, but they could only have existed through the coordinated efforts of an entire community. The legend also raises interesting questions about the relationship between public and private goods. The gardens were supposedly built for the private enjoyment of the royal family, yet they became a public symbol of Babylonian achievement and a wonder that attracted visitors from across the known world. This transformation from private luxury to public heritage suggests something important about how individual acts of creation can transcend their original purposes and become part of the common inheritance of humanity. Moreover, the story implies that the creation of beauty, even when motivated by personal rather than civic concerns, ultimately serves the broader community. The gardens brought fame and prestige to Babylon, attracted trade and tourism, demonstrated the city's technological capabilities, and provided employment for the many specialists required to build and maintain them. What began as one man's attempt to make his wife happy became a source of collective pride and economic benefit. This pattern, where private acts of creation generate public goods, appears throughout history in various forms. Great works of art commissioned by wealthy patrons become cultural treasures enjoyed by future generations. Scientific research funded for specific purposes yields knowledge that benefits humanity as a whole. Gardens designed for personal pleasure inspire techniques and aesthetic principles that influence landscape design for centuries. The Hanging Gardens, whether real or imagined, thus stand as an early example of how individual creativity and resources, when applied to ambitious projects, can generate benefits that extend far beyond their original scope and purpose. They suggest that the pursuit of beauty and excellence, even when motivated by personal desires, can serve broader human interests in ways that purely utilitarian projects often cannot. The technical innovations supposedly required for the gardens also point to an important aspect of human problem solving: the way seemingly impossible challenges can drive the development of new capabilities that prove useful far beyond their original application. The hydraulic engineering required to lift water to the heights described would have pushed the boundaries of contemporary technology, potentially leading to innovations in pumping, water management, and structural engineering that could be applied to other projects. Similarly, The botanical knowledge required to maintain exotic plants in an artificial environment would have advanced understanding of plant biology, soil science, and ecological relationships. The architectural techniques needed to create stable terraces capable of supporting the weight of trees and soil would have contributed to the development of more sophisticated building methods. This pattern, where ambitious projects drive technological advancement through the necessity of solving unprecedented problems, appears throughout human history. The construction of the pyramids advanced knowledge of mathematics, engineering, and logistics. The development of the printing press grew out of attempts to make books more widely available. The space program yielded innovations in materials science, computer technology, and communications that transformed daily life in ways that had nothing to do with space exploration. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed, would have represented an early example of this phenomenon, a project whose primary purpose was aesthetic and emotional, but whose execution required technical innovations that could have influenced engineering and agriculture for generations. The story also embodies a particular vision of the proper use of wealth and power that remains relevant to contemporary discussions of inequality and social responsibility. Rather than using his resources to build monuments to his own glory or to accumulate even greater wealth, the legendary Nebuchadnezzar devoted them to creating something that would bring joy to another person. This model suggests that the ultimate validation of great wealth is not its accumulation, but its transformation into forms of beauty and care that enhance life for others. This vision becomes particularly compelling when contrasted with other uses of comparable resources throughout history. The same wealth and labor that supposedly created the gardens could have built additional fortifications, funded military campaigns, or constructed monuments designed to intimidate enemies and impress subjects. The choice to create something beautiful rather than something fearsome or self-aggrandizing represents a different understanding of what makes life meaningful and what kinds of achievements are worth the investment of precious resources. The gardens thus function as a critique of purely acquisitive or dominating approaches to wealth and power. They suggest that the most profound satisfactions come not from possessing more than others or controlling others' behavior, but from using one's capabilities to create conditions where beauty and happiness can flourish. This critique remains relevant in contemporary discussions of how societies should evaluate the uses of great wealth. The legend of the gardens offers a standard against which other applications of resources can be measured. Do they create beauty, enhance life, demonstrate care for others, push the boundaries of human capability in positive directions? Or do they primarily serve to accumulate more power, intimidate competitors, or satisfy ego at the expense of broader human flourishing? And maybe that's why no ruin is needed, why the absence of archaeological evidence doesn't diminish the story's power. The Hanging Gardens live on, not in earth or clay, but in the collective imagination of every generation that has dreamed of turning stone into green, of making the impossible possible through human creativity and love. They survive as an inspiration, a reminder that the greatest monuments may be those that exist primarily in the realm of possibility, rather than fact. They endure as a vision of what we might accomplish when we choose to build up rather than tear down, when we direct our most impressive capabilities toward creation rather than destruction. The gardens remind us that sometimes the most important truths are not necessarily the most literal ones. Whether Nebuchadnezzar's gardens existed as described matters less than what they represent. The human capacity to imagine beauty into being, to love so deeply that we attempt the impossible, to dream of civilizations that measure their greatness not by the enemies they've conquered, but by the wonders they've created. So when you picture Babylon, don't just think of towers or gates or fallen walls. Don't limit your vision to the archaeological remains, important as they are for understanding the practical realities of ancient life. Think of a courtyard, silent except for the wind rustling through fig leaves. Think of footsteps on a damp stone path, the soft sound of sandals on moisture-cooled stone. Think of a king standing quietly beside his wife, both of them watching vines curl slowly toward the sun, both of them surrounded by the impossible green that love and human ingenuity have coaxed from the harsh earth. Think of water flowing uphill, of shade in the desert, of flowers blooming where flowers have no right to exist. Think of the sound of leaves rustling in a breeze that carries the scent of growing things instead of dust. Think of hands that chose to plant rather than destroy, of power that chose to create rather than conquer. Whether those hands were real or imagined, whether that power was historical fact or collective dream, the vision they represent continues to call to something deep in human nature. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, lost or never found, remain one of our most powerful symbols of what we might accomplish when we dare to dream beyond the merely possible. But gardens fade, rivers shift, and the stones of Babylon, once warm with life, have cooled slowly with the passage of centuries. Empires move on, carrying with them the rhythms of daily life, the patterns of work and worship that give meaning to human existence. The immediate concerns of survival and governance gradually replace the grand dreams of impossible beauty. Far from the myths and imagined courtyards, far from the debates about whether wonders existed or merely wished into being, another quiet devotion persisted. Not built on plants or palaces, not dependent on the shifting courses of rivers or the survival of stone monuments, but on something more elemental and enduring. Something that required not massive engineering projects or armies of workers, but only the steady commitment of individual human hearts to something larger than themselves. This devotion was built not on earth and water, but on fire. In temples where the air hung still and heavy with incense, where every breath was a prayer for balance. Between the forces of light and darkness that shaped the world, a different kind of keeper rose with the dawn each day. Their days were not marked by conquest or kings, by the rise and fall of empires, or the construction of wonders that might or might not survive the centuries. Instead, their lives followed rhythms older and more fundamental, the rhythm of ritual, of purity maintained through constant vigilance, of patience that measured time, not in seasons or years, but in the steady burning of sacred flames. In a world that changed constantly, where cities rose and fell, where rivers shifted course and gardens bloomed and withered, their task was to preserve something eternal. While archaeologists might debate the existence of hanging gardens, while historians might puzzle over the silence of ancient records, these guardians tended fires that had burned continuously for generations, flames that carried within them the hopes and prayers of countless souls seeking meaning in an uncertain world. Let's step now into one of those temples, leaving behind the grand uncertainties of royal gardens and impossible architecture. Let's enter a space where wonder was measured not in engineering, marvels, but in the simple miracle of a flame that refused to die, tended by hands that understood that sometimes the greatest human achievements are the quietest ones. Come and spend a quiet day beside the sacred fire, in the company of a Zoroastrian priest whose devotion spans not just his own lifetime, but reaches backward through centuries of unbroken tradition and forward into a future that only faith can guarantee. Imagine waking not to the sound of marching feet or clattering armor, but to stillness. The room is dim. The air is dry and smells faintly of ash and sandalwood. Outside, the sun has not yet risen. Inside, there is only one light, a flickering, steady flame, glowing behind a curtain of carved stone. It's not for warmth. It's not for show. It is the sacred fire, and it must never go out. You are a Mogd, a priest of Zoroastrianism, the faith of the Persian Empire. And this is how each day begins, not with noise, but with care. The darkness before dawn holds a particular quality in the fire temple. It is not the oppressive darkness of a dungeon or the restless darkness of a sleepless night. It is expectant darkness, pregnant with possibility, thick with the weight of centuries. Your bare feet touch the cold stone floor, and even this simple contact feels deliberate, meaningful. Every sensation is heightened in these moments before the world stirs. The scratch of linen against skin as you rise from your narrow cot. The whisper of air through the temple's carefully placed ventilation shafts. The distant murmur of water flowing through the purification channels that run beneath the building's foundation. Zoroastrianism was one of the world's earliest monotheistic religions, centered on the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra. At its heart was the belief in a single supreme God. Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord. Goodness, truth, and order were sacred. So was fire, not as a god, but as a symbol. A reflection of inner clarity. A pure thing in a world of mixture and confusion. But understanding this intellectually and living it daily are different things entirely. You have spent 15 years learning the distinction. 15 years moving from the theoretical knowledge of your youth to the embodied wisdom that now guides your hands as they reach for the ritual basin in the corner of your chamber. The water within was drawn yesterday at sunset from the temple's sacred well, filtered through layers of cotton and silk, then blessed with prayers that your predecessor taught you, just as his predecessor taught him, in an unbroken chain stretching back through generations. Your duties begin before first light. Before you even approach the temple flame, there are rituals of cleansing. Purity is central to your life, but not just in the moral sense. Physical purity is woven through every act. You wash your hands and face, not quickly, but deliberately, with water drawn and filtered the night before. Each droplet that touches your skin carries intention. The cold shock of it against your temples serves as both awakening and reminder. You are preparing to enter the presence of something greater than yourself. The washing is methodical. First the hands, each finger cleaned separately, the spaces between them, the crescents of the nails, then the wrists, the forearms. The face comes next, forehead, cheeks, chin, the delicate skin around the eyes. You cup water in your palms and let it run down your neck, feeling it trace paths along your collarbone before disappearing into the folds of your sleeping robe. This is not mere hygiene. This is preparation, transformation, a daily death and rebirth enacted in private before the sacred work can begin. You don a fresh robe of white linen, a symbol of your commitment to Asha, the truth, the natural order. The robe must be unspotted, smooth, but finding perfection in cloth, woven by human hands, is its own meditation. You examine each fold, each seam, searching for the stains that daily life inevitably brings. A spot of oil from yesterday's meal, a smudge of ash from tending the fire. These are not failures, but reminders of the constant vigilance required to maintain purity in an impure world. When you find such marks, you do not despair. You simply select another robe from the chest beside your bed, making a mental note to tend to the soiled one later with the proper ritual cleaning. The white linen itself tells a story. It comes from flax grown in fields blessed by Zoroastrian farmers, harvested at the proper time according to the sacred calendar, woven by artisans who understand their craft as a form of worship. The threads run straight and true, without the irregularities that might trap dust or harbor impurities. When you pull the robe over your head, feeling its weight settle across your shoulders, you are clothing yourself not just in fabric, but in the accumulated devotion of countless hands. A sash is tied at your waist, the custody, and you whisper prayers as you loop it 3 times around your middle. The custody is perhaps the most personal of all Zoroastrian symbols. Made of lamb's wool, it has been blessed and prepared according to ancient specifications. Its 72 threads represent the 72 chapters of the Yasna, the central liturgy of your faith. As you tie it, you recite the appropriate prayers, your voice barely above a whisper in the pre-dawn hush. The first loop represents good thoughts. Your mind, so often scattered by the demands of daily life, focuses now on the coming day's service. You think of the flame waiting in its chamber, patient and eternal. You think of the community members who will come seeking guidance, blessing, purification. You think of your fellow priests, each preparing in their own chambers for the day's work. The second loop represents good words. You consider the verses you will recite, the advice you will offer, the comfort you might provide to those in distress. Words have power in the Zoroastrian understanding. They can heal or harm, illuminate or obscure. As the Custian circles your waist a second time, you silently commit yourself to speaking only truth, only that which serves the light. The third loop represents good deeds. The actions you will take, the rituals you will perform, the small kindnesses that accumulate like drops of water in a desert cistern. The knot you tie to complete the binding is complex, requiring both hands and careful attention. If done incorrectly, you must untie it and begin again. There is no rushing this process, no shortcuts to sanctity. Only then may you enter the fire chamber. The corridor leading to the sacred fire is neither long nor elaborate, but it serves as a gradual transition from the ordinary world to the sacred one. The walls are unadorned, save for a few carefully carved inscriptions in ancient Avestan script. Your feet, now clad in the soft leather slippers reserved for temple use, make almost no sound on worn stone. You pass other chambers, storage rooms for the special woods used to feed the fire, a library containing copies of sacred texts, a small kitchen where ritual meals are prepared. Each doorway represents a different aspect of temple life, different ways of serving the sacred flame. The air grows warmer as you approach your destination. The scent of sandalwood becomes stronger, mixed now with the clean smell of well-tended fire. You pause before the final doorway, not from hesitation, but from reverence. What lies beyond is not merely a room, but a sacred space that has been continuously maintained for over 2 centuries. The fire burning within has never been extinguished, never been allowed to die. It represents an unbroken line of devotion, stretching back through generations of priests who have stood where you now stand. The fire temple is quiet, not grand like the halls of kings, but orderly, dignified. Walls of pale plaster rise to a domed ceiling, painted the deep blue of the pre-dawn sky. The dome is pierced by a circular opening at its apex, allowing smoke to escape and fresh air to enter, but also serving a deeper symbolic purpose. Through that opening, the sacred fire maintains its connection to the sky, to the realm of Ahura Mazda. During the day, sunlight streams through in a golden column. At night, stars are visible, distant points of celestial fire echoing the terrestrial flame below. Floors swept free of even a single pebble stretch between the walls and the central platform. This cleanliness is not mere aesthetics, but religious necessity. Every grain of sand, every fallen leaf, every mote of dust represents potential contamination of the sacred space. The sweeping is done with brushes made specifically for this purpose, crafted from materials that will not shed or leave residue. The person who sweeps must be in a state of ritual purity, must approach the task with the same reverence brought to any other sacred duty. The sacred fire rests in a bronze brazier on a raised platform. The brazier itself is a work of art, cast by master craftsmen who understood their work as a form of devotion. Its surface bears no decorative elements that might distract from its essential function, but its proportions are perfect, its lines clean and purposeful. The bronze has been polished to a warm glow that reflects the firelight, multiplying its radiance throughout the chamber. The platform on which the brazier rests is built of stone blocks fitted together without mortar, each one carefully selected and shaped. The height is precise, calculated so that the flame burns at the exact level prescribed by ancient tradition. Too low, and the fire loses its symbolic connection to the heavens. Too high, and it becomes presumptuous, reaching beyond its proper sphere. The platform's circular shape mirrors the dome above, creating a harmony of forms that pleases the eye and soothes the spirit. It is never left unattended. It is never allowed to die. Your first act is to feed it with dry wood from a special store, never damp, never fallen. The wood storage chamber adjoins the fire temple, connected by a small doorway that can be secured when not in use. Inside, carefully arranged on wooden racks, are pieces of specific trees, cut at particular times according to the sacred calendar. Sandalwood from trees that grew in blessed groves, cedar from mountain slopes that face the rising sun, apple wood from orchards tended by faithful farmers. Each type of wood burns differently, produces different qualities of flame and smoke, serves different ritual purposes. You select today's offering carefully, running your fingers along the grain of each piece, checking for any signs of moisture or decay. The wood must be completely dry, seasoned for at least a full year, before it can serve as fuel for the sacred fire. Any dampness would produce smoke that clouds the flame's pure light. Any rot would introduce corruption into the sacred space. The pieces you choose are smooth to the touch, light in weight, almost eager to burn. You add just enough to sustain it, not overwhelm it. The balance is delicate, learned through years of observation and practice. Too little fuel, and the fire diminishes, its light growing dim and uncertain. Too much, and it flares beyond control, consuming oxygen faster than the chamber's ventilation can replace it. The proper feeding of the fire is both art and science, requiring understanding of airflow, wood density, seasonal variations in humidity, even the subtle changes in atmospheric pressure that precede weather changes. You stir the embers gently, with tools made for no other purpose. The fire tools are kept in a niche beside the brazier, within easy reach, but carefully arranged. The poker, its tip worn smooth by generations of use. The small shovel for adjusting the coal bed. The bellows, crafted from leather, that has been specially treated to remain supple, despite exposure to heat. Each tool has been consecrated, blessed for its specific role in tending the sacred flame. They are never used for any mundane purpose, never touched by hands that have not first been ritually purified. The stirring itself follows a prescribed pattern, clockwise motions that encourage the natural flow of energy within the fire. You watch as sparks rise and dance in the heated air before winking out. The coals glow brighter as oxygen reaches them, their surfaces cracking and revealing the molten hearts within. The new wood catches quickly, its dry surface accepting the flame's embrace with a soft whisper of combustion. Then you recite verses from the Avesta, the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, in a rhythmic, careful voice. The words flow in ancient Avestan, a language preserved primarily for liturgical use, its archaic forms and ceremonial cadences carrying meanings that modern Persian cannot quite capture. Your voice echoes softly in the domed chamber, the acoustics designed to enhance and purify sound, just as the ventilation system purifies air. Yada, ahu verio, atharadish ashatshit, hasha banghush daz demanang shaya faninam, enghush mazde, shathremsha ahorai a yim dridu bidadat ahorai mazda. The words themselves are prayer, but their recitation is also meditation, a focusing of mind and spirit on the eternal truths they express. You do not rush. The words are old, older than the empire. They deserve stillness. They demand the full attention of both speaker and listener. Even though you are alone in the chamber, save for the fire itself, you are not truly solo. The flame is your congregation, your witness, your companion in worship. Each verse builds upon the last, creating a tapestry of meaning that encompasses the full scope of Zoroastrian belief. Praise for Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord who created all good things. Acknowledgement of the eternal battle between light and darkness, truth and falsehood, order and chaos. Commitment to the threefold path of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Gratitude for the gift of life and the opportunity to serve the light. Outside, the temple grounds begin to stir. Other priests arrive, their footsteps soft on the stone pathways that connect the various buildings of the complex. Acolytes sweep paths, fetch water, lay out fruit, or incense. The sound of their activities filters through the fire chamber's walls, muffled but reassuring. You are part of a community, a brotherhood united in service to the sacred flame and the truths it represents. Birds call faintly from date palms planted in the temple's courtyard garden. The palms were chosen not just for their beauty, but for their symbolic significance. Date palms represent fertility, abundance, the sweetness that life can offer to those who live in accordance with divine will. Their fronds rustle in the morning breeze, a sound like whispered prayers rising to the sky. The birds that nest among them are considered blessed, living creatures who share the sacred space without corrupting it. A child peeks in through a gate, curious. Children are naturally drawn to the temple, sensing perhaps the peace that pervades its grounds, even when they cannot yet understand its source. This particular child, a girl of perhaps 7 years, has wandered away from her family's home in the nearby quarter. Her wide eyes take in the unfamiliar sights. Priests moving with purposeful calm, the smell of incense and sacred fire, the hushed atmosphere of devotion. One of the younger priests notices her and approaches with gentle words, not to send her away, but to welcome her presence. Children are the future of the faith, and their curiosity should be nurtured, not discouraged. He explains in simple terms what the priests do, why the fire burns, how the temple serves the community. The girl listens with the intense focus that children bring to new experiences, her questions innocent but penetrating. But inside, you remain in the slow, soft rhythm of duty. The morning rituals continue according to their ancient pattern, unaffected by the gentle disturbances outside. This is not callousness, but necessity. The sacred fire requires constant attention, and its needs take precedence over all other considerations. The rhythm you have established through years of practice carries you forward, each action flowing naturally into the next. Throughout the day, your responsibilities are both spiritual and practical. The distinction between these categories, so clear to outsiders, blurs in the actual experience of temple life. Everything you do is spiritual, because everything serves the sacred flame and the community it blesses. Everything you do is practical, because faith without works is meaningless. Devotion without service is mere self-indulgence. You conduct rituals for the community, weddings, blessings, the maintenance of sacred spaces. Each ceremony has its own requirements, its own particular balance of ancient tradition and present need. A wedding might bring 2 families to the temple, their joy mingled with nervousness as they prepare to begin a new life together. You guide them through the ancient vows, help them understand the sacred nature of their commitment, offer prayers for their future happiness and fertility. The wedding ceremony itself takes place in the temple's main hall, a larger space adjacent to the fire chamber. The couple stands before a smaller fire, kindled from the eternal flame and tended throughout the ritual. They join hands while you recite the appropriate prayers, their fingers interlaced as their lives will be interlaced from this day forward. Rice and rose petals are scattered, symbols of abundance and beauty. Sweet wine is shared, representing the joy that should characterize their union. But weddings are only one type of ceremony. There are blessings for new businesses, prayers for travelers setting out on long journeys, rituals to mark the changing seasons. Each has its place in the temple calendar. Each serves to connect the community more closely to the divine source of all good things. Your role is not merely to perform these rituals, but to help participants understand their deeper meaning, to see beyond the outward forms to the spiritual truths they represent. You advise on matters of purity. If someone has touched something unclean, a corpse, a sick animal, a waste canal, they come to you, not for punishment, but for rebalancing. The concept of purity in Zoroastrianism is complex, encompassing both physical and spiritual dimensions. Contact with death, disease, or waste creates a kind of spiritual pollution that must be cleansed before the person can fully participate in religious life again. But this pollution is not permanent. not a stain that cannot be removed. It is more like dust that accumulates on a traveler's robe, something that can be washed away with the proper care and attention. The person who comes to you seeking purification is not a sinner, but someone who has encountered the inevitable impurities of daily life and now wishes to restore their proper relationship with the divine. You explain the rites patiently, going over each step to ensure understanding. The purification process might involve multiple washings with consecrated water, specific prayers to be recited, periods of isolation until the cleansing is complete. Some cases are simple, requiring only basic ablutions and brief prayers. Others are more complex, particularly those involving contact with death, requiring elaborate ceremonies that can last for days. You offer comfort if they'll accept it. Many who come for purification are distressed, worried that they have somehow damaged their relationship with Ahura Mazda. Your gentle explanations help them understand that purity and pollution are natural cycles, like the rhythm of day and night or the changing of seasons. What matters is not avoiding all contact with impurity, which would be impossible in any case, but responding appropriately when such contact occurs. The comfort you provide is not mere consolation but education, helping people understand the deeper purpose behind the purity laws. These restrictions are not arbitrary rules imposed by a capricious deity, but practical wisdom developed over centuries of observation and experience. They protect both individual and community health, maintain the sacred spaces that serve as focal points for worship, and provide a framework for thinking about the relationship between physical and spiritual well-being. You also study. Scrolls and tablets line the inner rooms, texts not just of prayer, but of philosophy, astronomy, agriculture, ethics. The temple library is one of the most extensive in the region, containing works in multiple languages and covering a vast range of subjects. Zoroastrianism has always emphasized the importance of knowledge, seeing ignorance as a form of darkness that must be dispelled by the light of understanding. The philosophical texts are particularly treasured. Ancient commentaries on the Avesta provide insights into the deeper meanings of familiar prayers and rituals. Treatises on ethics explore the practical implications of the threefold path, offering guidance for navigating the moral complexities of daily life. Works of natural philosophy attempt to understand the physical world as a reflection of divine order, seeing in the movements of stars and planets the same fundamental principles that govern human behavior. The astronomical texts serve both practical and spiritual purposes. The Zoroastrian calendar is based on careful observation of celestial cycles, and accurate timekeeping is essential for conducting rituals at the proper moments. But astronomy also provides a framework for understanding humanity's place in the cosmic order. The movements of the heavens reflect the eternal struggle between light and darkness, the gradual triumph of good over evil that will culminate in the renovation of the world. Agricultural knowledge might seem out of place in a temple library, but it serves important religious functions. Many rituals involve offerings of specific crops harvested at particular times. Understanding the growing cycles helps ensure that these offerings are of the highest quality, properly ripened, and free from disease or pest damage. Agricultural metaphors also pervade Zoroastrian scripture, and understanding farming practices helps illuminate the deeper meanings of these passages. The Zoroastrian worldview is not one of blind obedience, but of understanding. To live well is to think well, to speak truthfully, to act with justice. You may spend hours copying verses or debating fine points of doctrine with a fellow priest over a bowl of warm goat milk. The copying work is itself a form of meditation, requiring complete attention to detail and perfect reproduction of sacred texts. Each letter must be formed precisely, each word spaced correctly, each line aligned with mathematical precision. These copying sessions often become collaborative efforts, with multiple priests working on different sections of the same text. The work proceeds in companionable silence, broken occasionally by quiet questions about difficult passages or unclear script. The physical act of writing becomes a form of prayer, a way of internalizing the sacred words through the movement of hand and pen. The debates that arise during these sessions are never heated arguments, but thoughtful explorations of complex ideas. There are no loud arguments, only quiet conviction. A question might emerge about the precise meaning of an Avestan term, leading to careful examination of parallel passages and consultation of ancient commentaries. Different interpretations are considered respectfully, with each priest drawing on his own study and experience to contribute to the discussion. These intellectual exchanges serve multiple purposes. They deepen understanding of the faith's core teachings, help resolve practical questions that arise in ministering to the community, and maintain the tradition of scholarly inquiry that has always characterized Zoroastrianism. The priests involved learn from each other, refining their knowledge through dialogue and debate. Meals are simple. A flatbread, still warm from the oven, its surface marked with the traditional patterns that identify it as temple bread. A few olives, their oil gleaming in the afternoon light, carefully selected for their freedom from blemish. Lentils in clay bowls, cooked with herbs grown in the temple garden and seasoned with salt that has been blessed according to ancient custom. The simplicity of these meals is intentional, reflecting the Zoroastrian emphasis on moderation and contentment. Rich foods and elaborate preparation can become distractions from spiritual focus, drawing attention to bodily pleasures rather than divine truths. Plain fare served in the temple nourishes the body without overwhelming the senses, providing energy for sacred work without encouraging gluttony or excess. But simple does not mean careless. Each ingredient has been carefully chosen and properly prepared. The grain for the bread comes from fields that have been blessed and worked according to religious principles. The olives are pressed with equipment that has been purified and dedicated to sacred use. Even the water used in cooking has been drawn from the temple's consecrated well and filtered through materials that will not contaminate its purity. You eat in silence, then wash. Always wash. The silence during meals is not enforced by strict rule, but emerges naturally from the contemplative atmosphere of temple life. Words during eating would be distractions, pulling attention away from the simple gratitude that should accompany the consumption of food. The act of eating becomes itself a form of prayer, an acknowledgement of dependence on divine providence for sustenance. The washing that follows is as ritualized as the washing that preceded the morning's duties. Hands and mouth are cleansed, removing any trace of food that might contaminate other activities. The bowls and utensils are cleaned with equal care, scrubbed with sand, and rinsed with clean water until they shine. Nothing is left to chance. Nothing is treated as merely mundane. You might walk the temple's edge in the afternoon, observing the sky. The temple grounds are enclosed by a low wall that serves both practical and symbolic functions. Practically, it marks the boundary of sacred space and keeps out animals that might contaminate the area. Symbolically, it represents the distinction between the ordered world of religious life and the chaotic realm beyond. The walk along this boundary becomes a form of meditation, a way of maintaining awareness of the relationship between inner and outer worlds. Your footsteps trace a familiar path worn smooth by generations of priests who have walked this same route. The repetitive motion frees the mind to contemplate deeper questions while the body engages in gentle exercise. The elements are sacred: fire, water, earth, air, and their balance matters. Zoroastrianism recognizes these four elements as fundamental components of the physical world, each possessing its own sacred character and requiring its own forms of reverence. Fire, represented by the eternal flame, embodies the light of divine truth. Water, flowing through the temple's purification channels, cleanses both body and spirit. Earth, supporting all growing things, provides the foundation for physical existence. Air, carrying breath and life, connects all living beings to the cosmic spirit. If the wind changes direction, it is noted. Changes in wind patterns can affect the behavior of the sacred fire, alter the temple's ventilation, influence the growth of plants in the garden. But beyond these practical considerations, wind direction carries symbolic significance. Wind from the east brings the blessings of the rising sun. Wind from the west carries the coolness of evening rest. Each direction has its own associations, its own messages for those who know how to read them. If clouds gather oddly, it is pondered. The sky serves as a vast text written in the language of divine providence, its changing patterns offering insights into the cosmic order. Unusual cloud formations might herald changes in weather that will affect agricultural communities served by the temple. They might also carry deeper meanings, symbolic messages about the eternal struggle between light and darkness. You do not rush to interpret omens. Your role is not to predict, but to observe, patiently, humbly. The ability to read signs and natural phenomena comes only through years of careful attention, and even then interpretation requires great caution. Too hasty a reading can lead to false conclusions, while too confident a proclamation can create unnecessary anxiety in the community. The observation itself is more important than any specific interpretation. By maintaining constant awareness of natural cycles and patterns, you develop a deeper appreciation for the interconnectedness of all things. The flight of birds, the behavior of insects, the changing colors of sunset, all become part of a vast symphony of meaning that speaks to those who have learned to listen. As the sun lowers, shadows stretch across the temple floor. The geometry of light and shadow changes throughout the day, creating different moods and atmospheres within the same physical space. Morning light is crisp and clear, emphasizing clean lines and sharp contrasts. Afternoon light is warmer, softer, more forgiving of imperfections. Evening light is golden and nostalgic, lending dignity even to humble objects. You prepare again for the evening rites. The fire must be tended at dusk as it was at dawn. The rhythm of fire tending follows the natural cycle of day and night, acknowledging the sacred character of both light and darkness. Evening rituals are not mere repetitions of morning ones, but distinct ceremonies with their own prayers and purposes. A fresh log is selected from the wood store, chosen with the same care that guided the morning's selection, but with attention to evening's particular requirements. The wood for evening fires should burn with a steady, gentle flame that will last through the night without requiring frequent attention. Denser woods that burn slowly are preferred, pieces that will maintain their form while releasing heat and light in measured amounts. A whispered prayer accompanies the feeding of the fire, words of gratitude for the day's blessings and petition for protection through the coming darkness. The prayer acknowledges the dual nature of night, a time of rest and restoration, but also a time when the forces of darkness are most active. The sacred fire serves as a beacon of hope and a fortress of light, holding back the shadows that would otherwise overwhelm the world. You kneel, not in submission, but in stewardship. The physical posture of kneeling serves multiple purposes in Zoroastrian practice. It demonstrates respect for the sacred flame and humility before the divine presence it represents. It also brings you closer to the fire, allowing more intimate communion with its light and warmth. But most importantly, it embodies the proper relationship between priest and sacred duty, not one of domination or control, but of service and care. You are a caretaker, not a ruler. This understanding permeates every aspect of temple life and distinguishes Zoroastrian priesthood from many other religious traditions. You do not command the fire or manipulate it for personal purposes. You do not claim special powers or demand worship from others. Your authority comes not from position, but from knowledge, not from rank, but from service. You do not worship the fire, but what it represents: light in darkness, warmth in cold, clarity in confusion. The distinction is crucial, separating Zoroastrianism from the fire worship that outsiders sometimes mistake it for. The flame is a symbol, a focus for meditation and prayer, a visible representation of invisible truths. But it is not itself divine, not an object of ultimate devotion. The light it represents is the light of Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord who created all good things and who will ultimately triumph over evil and falsehood. The warmth it provides echoes the warmth of divine love, the caring providence that sustains all life. The clarity it brings mirrors the clarity of divine truth, the understanding that dispels ignorance and guides right action. By nightfall, the temple returns to its hush. The daily activities of the temple community wind down as darkness settles over the grounds. The last visitors depart. The acolytes complete their final tasks. The other priests retire to their chambers for rest or private study. The great silence that will last until dawn begins to reassert itself, broken only by the soft sounds of the eternal flame and the gentle movements of the night watch. You sit for a while beside the flame, not because it requires you, but because you wish to. These moments of quiet communion are among the most precious of the day, times when the pressures of duty and service fade into the background, and you can simply be present with the sacred fire. There is no agenda for these sessions, no specific prayers to recite or rituals to perform. There is only presence, attention, openness to whatever insights might arise. You reflect not just on your duties, but on the slow, steady path of life within the empire. The Persian Empire stretches across vast distances, encompassing many peoples and cultures, yet the sacred fire you tend connects you to Zoroastrian communities throughout this enormous realm. In temples from India to the Mediterranean, other priests perform similar duties, tend similar flames, maintain the same ancient traditions. So much beyond your walls is chaotic. Kings rise and fall with bewildering rapidity, their reigns measured in years or decades rather than centuries. Wars churn across the landscape, bringing devastation to some regions while leaving others untouched. Cities grow and prosper, then decline and disappear, their populations scattered by conquest or natural disaster. Empires expand and contract like living things, breathing in territory and resources, exhaling refugees and tribute. But here, there is stillness. The temple exists in a different kind of time, measured not by the rise and fall of dynasties, but by the patient accumulation of days spent in service to eternal truth. The fire you tend today is the same fire that burned yesterday and will burn tomorrow. Its constancy providing an anchor of stability in a world of constant change. This stillness is not stagnation but depth, not emptiness but fullness. It is the stillness of deep water, which appears motionless on the surface but contains powerful currents beneath. It is the stillness of growing things, which seem inactive but are constantly drawing energy from soil and sun. It is the stillness of contemplation, which appears passive but generates insights that can transform understanding. Your thoughts drift, perhaps, to the future. The empire that seems so permanent, so invincible, will someday pass away like all earthly powers. New rulers will arise. New religions will compete for followers' loyalty. New ideas will challenge ancient traditions. The temple itself might fall into ruin, its walls crumbling and its gardens returning to wilderness. But the truths it represents will endure, finding new expressions in new times and places. To weather the fire will outlast you. Your own life is measured in decades, not centuries. The body that now serves the flame will age and weaken, eventually requiring replacement by younger hands and stronger backs. The knowledge you have accumulated through years of study and practice will need to be transmitted to the next generation, passed along like the flame itself from one guardian to another. To whether the next generation will guard it as carefully. Each new priest brings his own personality, his own understanding, his own relationship with the sacred traditions. Some will be more diligent than others, more knowledgeable, more devoted. Some will face challenges that you have never encountered, pressures that will test their commitment in new ways. The future of the faith depends on their faithfulness, their ability to adapt ancient wisdom to changing circumstances without losing its essential character. But for now, that is not your concern. The future will bring its own problems and its own solutions. The past has already been written, its lessons learned and incorporated into present practice. What matters is the present moment, the current state of the flame, the immediate responsibilities that claim your attention. For now, it flickers, it burns. The light dances and wavers, but never fails, fed by your care and the care of those who will follow you. The heat radiates outward, warming the chamber and everything within it. The smoke rises through the opening in the dome, carrying prayers and offerings up to the realm of Ahura Mazda. And you keep watch. This is your calling, your purpose, your contribution to the great work of maintaining light in a dark world. The watching requires no special skills beyond attention and commitment. It demands no heroic gestures, no dramatic sacrifices. It asks only that you remain present, remain faithful, remain ready to serve as circumstances require. The hours pass slowly in the temple's timeless atmosphere. Outside, the life of the empire continues its restless course. Merchants travel the great roads, carrying goods between distant cities. Farmers work their fields under starlight, preparing for the next day's labor. Soldiers stand guard at frontier posts, watching for signs of trouble from hostile neighbors. Nobles gather in palace halls, plotting advancement or defending their positions. Common people sleep in their beds, dreaming of better days or worrying about tomorrow's challenges. But here, in this small chamber lit by sacred fire, time moves differently. Minutes stretch into eternities of contemplation. Hours compress into moments of perfect clarity. The boundary between self and service dissolves, leaving only the pure intention to guard and nurture the flame that represents humanity's highest aspirations. As you sit in vigil beside the eternal fire, your mind begins to wander beyond the temple walls, beyond even the familiar concerns of your daily duties. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve the light and guide the faithful. But tonight belongs to reflection, to the deep communion that can only occur in the presence of the sacred flame. Tonight, the fire burns steadily in its bronze brazier, and you keep faithful watch, as countless priests have done before you, and countless more will do after you are gone. The rhythm of devotion continues, ancient and unbroken, a thread of gold running through the tapestry of human history. Yet even as you tend this eternal flame in your small corner of the great Persian Empire, other forces are stirring in distant lands. Far to the west, beyond the reach of Persian satraps and the influence of Zoroastrian priests, a different kind of fire burns in the hearts of men. Not the controlled sacred flame of your temple, but the wildfire of ambition and conquest. In the mountains and valleys of a peninsula called Greece, city-states are beginning to look beyond their borders with hungry eyes. Their gods are different, their customs strange, their vision of the world at odds with everything your empire represents. The night air carries whispers of change, though you cannot yet interpret their meaning. Ships are being built in harbors you have never seen, weapons forged in smithies that serve alien purposes, alliances formed between peoples who speak in tongues unknown to Persian ears. The very stars seem to shift in their courses, suggesting that the age of Persian dominance, which has seemed as eternal as your sacred fire, may be entering a new phase. But these are concerns for kings and generals, for the great ones who shape the destinies of nations. Your world remains bounded by temple walls, your responsibilities measured in the steady rhythm of flame tending and prayer. Yet something in the quality of tonight's silence suggests that even the most secluded, religious life cannot remain forever untouched by the great currents of history. The empire that has provided the framework for your faith, the peace that has allowed your temple to flourish, may soon face challenges that will test not only political and military strength, but the very foundations of Persian civilization. The fire flickers once, as if responding to these unspoken thoughts, then settles back into its steady burn. Whatever storms may come, whatever changes may reshape the world beyond these walls, the flame will endure. It has survived the rise and fall of kingdoms before, outlasted the ambitions of conquerors, continued burning through ages of upheaval and transformation. Your duty remains unchanged: to guard the light, to preserve the truth, to maintain the sacred fire that connects earth to heaven. As dawn approaches and your long vigil nears its end, you sense that you are witnessing the close of an era. The next priest to take your place beside this flame may face trials that you cannot imagine, may be called upon to preserve these ancient traditions in circumstances it would seem impossible to navigate. But that is tomorrow's burden. Tonight, the fire burns bright and steady, and you keep faithful watch, as you have sworn to do, until the sun rises once again over the Persian Empire. And now, our time together gently comes to an end. Tonight, we walked slowly through the dust and discipline of a Persian campaign trail, where sore feet and sunburned shoulders carried the weight of imperial glory. We stood beneath the towering gates of Babylon, listening to the quiet conquest that reshaped the world. We wandered softly through gardens that may never have existed, but whose story still blooms in the quiet corners of memory. And we sat beside the steady flame of a Zoroastrian fire temple, where the world turned slowly, carefully, in devotion to something higher. These were not just events or places. They were rhythms. The slow rhythm of marching feet, the patient rhythm of ancient river currents, the ritual rhythm of prayers spoken before dawn. A past not made of noise, but of texture, of woven linen, of damp clay, of worn sandals and cool shade. It's easy to imagine empires as loud things: trumpets and battles, statues and proclamations. But as we saw tonight, they were also quiet things, personal things. A soldier adjusting his cloak in the wind, a priest stirring embers in the dark, a woman dreaming of home among unfamiliar trees. Let your thoughts rest in that quiet now. No need to hold on to names or dates. Let them slip gently away. Let the stillness of the temple, the hush of the gardens, the soft rustle of banners along the desert wind settle in your mind like dust on a stone floor. Even the mightiest empires are, in the end, remembered not just for what they conquered, but for how they lived, how they moved, how they waited. So wherever you are listening from, whether wrapped in blankets or gently swaying on a train, whether in a city that never sleeps or a countryside under stars, let the slow rhythm of the past carry you into rest. Thank you for sharing this space with me tonight. We'll return again to some other corner of time. But for now, sleep well.